Part 3, Chapter 10 of A Raw Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Raw Youth by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated by Constance Garnett. Part 3, Chapter 10. But, again anticipating the course of events, I find it is necessary to explain to the reader something of what is coming, for the logical sequence of the story is obscured by such numerous incidents that otherwise it would be impossible to understand it. That something is the deadly noose to which Tatiana Pavlovna let slip an allusion. It appeared that Anna Andreyevna had ventured at last on the most audacious step that could be imagined in her position. She certainly had a will of her own. On the pretext of his health, the old prince had been in the nick of time carried off to Tsarskoe Selo, so that the news of his approaching marriage with Anna Andreyevna might not be spread abroad, but might for the time be stifled, so to say, in embryo. Yet the feeble old man, with whom one could do anything else, would not on any consideration have consented to give up his idea and jilt Anna Andreyevna, who had made him an offer. On this subject he was a paragon of chivalry, so that he might sooner or later bestir himself and suddenly proceed to carry out his intentions with that irresistible force which is so very frequently met with in weak characters, for they often have a line beyond which they cannot be driven. Moreover, he fully recognized the delicacy of the position of Anna Andreyevna, for whom he had an unbounded respect. He was quite alive to the possibility of rumors, of gibes, of injurious gossip. The only thing that checked him and kept him quiet for the time was that Katerina Nikolaevna had never once allowed herself to drop the faintest hint reflecting on Anna Andreyevna in his presence, or to raise the faintest objection to his intention of marrying her. On the contrary, she showed the greatest cordiality and every attention to her father's fiancée. In this way, Anna Andreyevna was placed in an extremely awkward position, perceiving, with her subtle feminine instinct, that she would wound all the old prince's tenderest feelings, and would arouse his distrust and even perhaps his indignation by the slightest criticism of Katerina Nikolaevna, whom he worshipped too, and now more than ever, just because she had so graciously and dutifully consented to his marriage. And so, for the present, the conflict was waged on that plane. The two rivals vied with one another in delicacy and patience, and as time went on, the prince did not know which of them to admire the most, and like all weak but tender-hearted people, he ended by being miserable and blaming himself for everything. His depression of spirits reached a morbid point, I was told. His nerves were thoroughly upset, and instead of regaining health in Tsarskoe, he was, so I was assured, on the point of taking to his bed. Here I may note in parenthesis what I only learnt long afterwards, that Böhring had bluntly proposed to Katerina Nikolaevna that they should take the old gentleman abroad, inducing him to go by some sort of strategy, letting people know privately meanwhile that he had gone out of his mind, and obtaining a doctor's certificate to that effect abroad. But Katerina Nikolaevna would not consent to that on any account. So at least it was declared afterwards. She seems to have rejected the project with indignation. All this is only a rather roundabout rumor, but I believe it. And just when things had reached this apparently hopeless position, Anna Andreyevna suddenly learnt through Lambert that there was in existence a letter, in which the daughter had consulted a lawyer about declaring her father insane. Her proud and revengeful mind was roused to the utmost. Recalling previous conversations with me, and putting together many trifling circumstances, she could not doubt the truth of it. Then, inevitably, the plan of a bold stroke matured in her resolute, inflexible, feminine heart. That plan was to tell the prince all about it, suddenly, with no preliminaries or negotiations, to frighten him, to give him a shock, to prove to him that what inevitably awaited him was the lunatic asylum, and if he were perverse, if he refused to believe and expressed indignation, to show him his daughter's letter, as though to say, since there was once an intention of declaring him insane, it might well be tried again in order to prevent his marriage. Then to take the frightened and shattered old man to Petersburg, straight to my lodging. It was a terrible risk, but she had complete confidence in her powers. Here I will digress for a moment to observe that the later course of events proved that she had not been mistaken as to the effect of this blow. What is more, the effect of it exceeded her expectations. The news of the existence of this letter produced perhaps a far stronger effect on the old prince than she or any of us had anticipated. I had no idea until then that the old prince had heard of this letter before, but, like all weak and timid people, he did not believe the rumor, and did his utmost to dismiss it from his mind in order to preserve his serenity. What is more, he reproached himself for his baseness in being ready to believe it. I may add the fact, that is the existence of the letter, had a far greater effect on Katerina Nikolaevna than I had expected. In fact, this scrap of paper turned out to be of far greater consequence than I, carrying it in my pocket, had imagined. But I am running too far ahead. But why, I shall be asked, to my lodgings? Why convey the old prince to my pitiful little den, and alarm him, perhaps, by the sordidness of his surroundings? If not to his own home, where all her plans might be thwarted at once, why not to some sumptuous private apartments, as Lambert urged? But it was just on this that Anna Andreyevna reckoned in her desperate step. Her chief object was to confront the prince with the document, but nothing would have induced me to give it up. And as there was no time to lose, Anna Andreyevna, relying on her power to carry off the position, resolved to begin without the document, bringing the old prince straight to me. For what purpose? To catch me by that same step, so to say, to kill two birds with one stone. She reckoned on working upon me by the sudden blow, the shock, the unexpectedness of it. She anticipated that when I found the old man in my room, when I saw his helplessness and his alarm, and heard them all imploring me, I should give in and show the document. I must confess, her calculation was crafty and clever, and showed psychological insight. What is more, she was very nearly successful. As for the old man, Anna Andreyevna had succeeded in bringing him away, and had forced him to believe her simply by telling him that she was bringing him to me. All this I learned later. The mere statement that the letter was in my hands extinguished in his timid heart the last doubts of the fact, so great were his love and respect for me. I may remark, too, that Anna Andreyevna herself never for a moment doubted that I still had the letter, and had not let it go out of my hands. Her great mistake was that she had a wrong conception of my character, and was cynically reckoning on my innocence, my good nature, and even my sentimentality. And, on the other hand, she imagined that even if I had made up my mind to give up the letter, to Katerina Nikolaevna, for instance, I should only do so under special conditions, and she made haste to anticipate those conditions by the suddenness, the unexpectedness of her master-stroke. And finally, Lambert confirmed her in all this. I have mentioned already that Lambert's position at this time was most critical. The traitor would have liked above everything to lure me from Anna Andreevna, so that with him I might sell the letter to Madame Amakov, which he, for some reason, considered a more profitable course. But since nothing would induce me to give up the document till the last moment, he decided, at any rate, to act with Anna Andreevna also, that he might not risk losing everything, and therefore he did his utmost to force his services on her till the very last hour. And I know that he even offered to procure a priest if necessary. But Anna Andreevna had asked him, with a contemptuous smile, not to suggest this. Lambert struck her as horribly coarse, and aroused her utmost aversion. But, to be on the safe side, she still accepted his services, as a spy, for instance. By the way, I do not know for certain to this day whether they bought over Pyotr Ippolitovitch, my landlord, and whether he got anything at all from them for his services, or whether he simply worked for them for the joy of intrigue. But that he acted as a spy upon me, and that his wife did also, I know for a fact. The reader will understand now that, though I was to some extent forewarned, yet I could not have guessed that the next day, or the day after, I should find the old prince in my lodgings, and in such circumstances. Indeed, I never could have conceived of such audacity from Anna Andreevna. One may talk freely and hint at anything one likes, but to decide, to act, and to carry things out, well, that really is character. To continue, I waked up late in the morning. I slept an exceptionally sound and dreamless sleep, as I remember with wonder, so that I waked up next morning feeling unusually confident again, as though nothing had happened the day before. I intended not going first to mother's, but straight to the church of the cemetery, with the idea of returning to mother's after the ceremony and remaining the rest of the day. I was firmly convinced that, in any case, I should meet him sooner or later at mother's. Neither Alphonsine nor the landlord had been at the flat for a long time. I would not on any account question the landlady, and indeed I made up my mind to cut off all relations with them for the future, and even to give up my lodgings as soon as I could. And so, as soon as my coffee had been brought, I put the hook on the door again. But suddenly there was a knock at the door, and to my surprise it turned out to be Treshatov. I opened the door at once, and delighted to see him, asked him to come in, but he refused. "I will only say 2 words from the door, or perhaps I will come in, for I fancy one must talk in a whisper here, only I won't sit down. You are looking at my horrid coat. Lambert took my greatcoat." He was, in fact, wearing a wretched old greatcoat, which did not fit him. He stood before me without taking off his hat, a gloomy, dejected figure, with his hands in his pockets. "I won't sit down. I won't sit down. Listen, Dolgoruki. I know nothing in detail, but I know that Lambert is preparing some treachery against you at once, and you won't escape it, and that's certain. And so, be careful. I was told by that pock-marked fellow, do you remember him? But he did not tell me anything more about it, so I can't tell you. I've only come to warn you. Goodbye." "But sit down, dear Trishatov. Though I'm in a hurry, I'm so glad to see you," I cried. "I won't sit down. I won't sit down, but I shall remember you were glad to see me. Oh, Dolgoruki, why deceive others? I've consciously, of my own free will, consented to every sort of abomination, to things so vile that I can't speak of them before you. Now we are at the pock-marked fellows. Goodbye. I am not worthy to sit down with you." "Nonsense, Trishatov, dear." "No, you see, Dolgoruki, I keep a bold face before everyone, and I'm going to have a rollicking time. I shall soon have a better fur coat than my old one, and shall be driving a fast trotter. But I shall know in my own mind that I did not sit down in your room because I judge myself unworthy, because I'm low compared with you. It will always be nice for me to remember that when I'm in the midst of disgraceful debauchery. Goodbye. Goodbye, and I won't give you my hand. Why, Alphonsine won't take my hand. And please don't follow me or come to see me. That's a compact between us." The strange boy turned and went out. I had no time then, but I made up my mind to seek him out as soon as I had settled our affairs. I won't describe the rest of that morning, though there is a great deal that might be recalled. Versaloff was not at the funeral service in the church, and I fancy from their faces I could have gathered that they did not expect him there. Mother prayed devoutly, and seemed entirely absorbed in the service. There were only Liza and Tatiana Pavlovna by the coffin. But I will describe nothing. After the burial, we all returned and sat down to a meal, and again I gathered by their faces that he was not expected to it. When we rose from the table, I went up to Mother, embraced her, and congratulated her on her birthday. Liza did the same after me. "Listen, brother," Liza whispered to me on the sly. "They are expecting him." "I guessed so, Liza. I see it." "He is certainly coming." So they must have heard something positive, I thought, but I didn't ask any question. Though I'm not going to describe my feelings, all this mystery began to weigh like a stone upon my heart again, in spite of my confident mood. We all settled down in the drawing-room, near Mother, at the round table. Oh, how I liked being with her then, and looking at her. Mother suddenly asked me to read something out of the Gospel. I read a chapter from St. Luke. She did not weep, and was not even very sorrowful, but her face had never seemed to me so full of spiritual meaning. There was the light of thought in her gentle eyes, but I could not trace in them any sign that she expected something with apprehension. The conversation never flagged. We recalled many reminiscences of Makar Ivanovitch. Tatiana Pavlovna, too, told us many things about him of which I had no idea before. And, in fact, it would make an interesting chapter if it were all written down. Even Tatiana Pavlovna wore quite a different air from usual. She was very gentle, very affectionate, and, what is more, also very quiet, though she talked a good deal to distract Mother's mind. But one detail I remember well. Mother was sitting on the sofa, and on a special round table on her left there lay, apparently put there for some purpose, a plain antique icon, with halos on the heads of the saints, of which there were two. This icon had belonged to Makar Ivanovitch. I knew that, and knew also that the old man had never parted from it, and looked upon it with superstitious reverence. Tatiana Pavlovna glanced at it several times. "Listen, Sophia," she said, suddenly changing the conversation. "Instead of the icon's lying down, would it not be better to stand it up on the table against the wall, and to light the lamp before it?" "No, better as it is," said mother. "I dare say you're right. It might seem making too much fuss." I did not understand at the time, but this icon had long ago been verbally bequeathed by Makar Ivanovitch to Andrei Petrovitch, and mother was preparing to give it to him now. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We were still talking when I noticed a sudden quiver in mother's face. She drew herself up quickly and began listening, while Tatiana Pavlovna, who was speaking at the time, went on talking without noticing anything. I at once turned to the door, and an instant later saw Andrei Petrovitch in the doorway. He had come in by the back stairs, through the kitchen and the passage, and mother was the only one of us who had heard his footsteps. Now I will describe the whole of the insane scene that followed word by word and gesture by gesture. It was brief. To begin with, I did not at the first glance anyway observe the slightest change in his face. He was dressed as always, that is, almost foppishly. In his hand was a small but expensive nosegay of fresh flowers. He went up and handed it to mother with a smile. She was looking at him with frightened perplexity, but she took the nosegay, and a faint flush at once glowed on her pale cheeks, and there was a gleam of pleasure in her eyes. "I knew you would take it like that, Sonia," he said. As we all got up when he came in, he took Liza's easy chair, which was on the left of mother, and sat down in it without noticing he was taking her seat. And so he was quite close to the little table on which the icon was lying. "Good evening to you all. I felt I must bring you this nosegay on your birthday, Sonia, and so I did not go to the funeral, as I could not come to the grave with a nosegay, and you didn't expect me at the funeral, I know. The old man certainly won't be angry at these flowers, for he bequeathed us joy himself, didn't he? I believe he's here somewhere in the room." Mother looked at him strangely. Tatiana Pavlovna seemed to wince. "Who's here in the room?" she asked. "Makar Ivanovitch. Never mind. You know that the man who is not entirely a believer in these marvels is always more prone to superstition. But I had better tell you about the nosegay. How I succeeded in bringing it I don't know. 3 times on the way I had a longing to throw it in the snow and trample on it." Mother shuddered. "A terrible longing. You must have pity on me and my poor head, Sonia. I longed to because they are too beautiful. Is there any object in the world more beautiful than a flower? I carried it, with snow and frost all round. Our frost and flowers, such an incongruity. I wasn't thinking of that, though. I simply longed to crush it, because it was so lovely. Sonia, though I'm disappearing again now, I shall soon come back, for I believe I shall be afraid. If I am afraid, who will heal me of my terrors? Where can I find an angel like Sonia? What is this icon you've got here? Ah, Makar Ivanovitch's, I remember. It belonged to his family, his ancestors. He would never part from it. I know. I remember he left it to me. I quite remember. And I fancy it's an unorthodox one. Let me have a look at it." He took up the icon, carried it to the light, and looked at it intently, but after holding it a few seconds only, laid it on the table before him. I was astonished, but all his strange speech was uttered so quickly that I had not time to reflect upon it. All I remember is that a sick feeling of dread began to clutch at my heart. Mother's alarm had passed into perplexity and compassion. She looked on him as someone, above all, to be pitied. It had sometimes happened in the past that he had talked almost as strangely as now. Liza, for some reason, became suddenly very pale, and strangely made a sign to me with a motion of her head towards him. But most frightened of all was Tatiana Pavlovna. "What's the matter with you, Andrei Petrovitch, darling?" she inquired cautiously. "I really don't know, Tatiana Pavlovna, dear, what's the matter with me. Don't be uneasy. I still remember that you are Tatiana Pavlovna, and that you are dear. But I've only come for a minute, though. I should like to say something nice to Sonia, and I keep trying to find the right word, though my heart is full of words which I don't know how to utter. Yes, really, all such strange words, somehow. Do you know, I feel as though I were split in two?" He looked round at us all, with a terribly serious face, and with perfectly genuine candor. "Yes, I am really split in two mentally, and I'm horribly afraid of it. It's just as though one's second self were standing beside one. One is sensible and rational oneself, but the other self is impelled to do something perfectly senseless and sometimes very funny. And suddenly you notice that you are longing to do that amusing thing, goodness knows why. That is what you want to, as it were, against your will. Though you fight against it with all your might, you want to. I once knew a doctor who suddenly began whistling in church at his father's funeral. I really was afraid to come to the funeral today because, for some reason, I was possessed by a firm conviction that I should begin to whistle or laugh in church like that unfortunate doctor who came to rather a bad end. And I really don't know why, but I've been haunted by the thought of that doctor all day. I am so haunted by him that I can't shake him off. Do you know, Sonia, here I've taken up the icon again." He had picked it up and was turning it about in his hand. "And do you know, I have a dreadful longing now, this very second, to smash it against the stove, against this corner. I am sure it would break into two halves, neither more or less." What was most striking was that he said this without the slightest trace of affectation or whimsical caprice. He spoke quite simply, but that made it all the more terrible, and he seemed really frightened of something. I noticed suddenly that his hands were trembling a little. "Andrei Petrovitch!" cried Mother, clasping her hands. "Let the icon alone! Let it alone, Andrei Petrovitch! Let it alone! Put it down!" cried Tatiana Pavlovna, jumping up. "Undress and go to bed. Arkady, run for the doctor." But what a fuss you're making," he said gently, scrutinizing us all intently. Then he suddenly put both elbows on the table and leaned his head in his hands. "I'm scaring you, but I tell you what, my friends, try to comfort me a little. Sit down again and all be calm, if only for a minute. Sonia, I did not come to talk of this at all. I came to tell you something, but it was quite different. Goodbye, Sonia. I'm going off on my wanderings again, as I have left you several times before, but no doubt I shall come back to you again one day. In that sense you are inevitable. To whom should I come back when all is over? Believe, Sonia, that I've come to you now as to an angel, and not as to an enemy. How could you be an enemy to me? How could you be an enemy?" Don't imagine that I came to break this icon, for do you know, Sonia, I am still longing to break it all the same." When Tatiana Pavlovna had cried out, "Let the icon alone," she had snatched it out of his hands and was holding it in hers. Suddenly, at his last word, he jumped up impulsively, snatched the icon in a flash from Tatiana's hands, and with a ferocious swing smashed it with all his might against the corner of the tiled stove. The icon was broken into 2 pieces. He turned to us, and his pale face suddenly flushed red, almost purple, and every feature in his face quivered and worked. "Don't take it for a symbol, Sonia. It's not as Makar's legacy I have broken it, but only to break something. And anyway, I shall come back to you, my last angel. You may take it as a symbol, though. Of course it must have been so." And with sudden haste he went out of the room, going again through the kitchen, where he had left his fur coat and cap. I won't attempt to describe what happened to Mother. In mortal terror she stood clasping her hands above her, and she suddenly screamed after him, "Andrei Petrovitch, come back, if only to say good-bye, dear." "He'll come, Sophia, he'll come. Don't worry yourself," Tatiana shrieked, trembling all over in a terrible rage, a really brutal rage. "Why, you heard he promised to come back himself. Let him go and amuse himself for the last time, the fool. He's getting old, and who'll nurse him when he's bedridden except you, his old nurse? Why, he tells you so himself. He's not ashamed." As for us, Liza was in a swoon. I would have run after him, but I rushed to Mother. I threw my arms round her and held her tight. Lukerya ran in with a glass of water for Liza, but Mother soon came to herself. She sank on the sofa, hid her face in her hands, and began crying. But you'd better run after him!" Tatiana Pavlovna shouted suddenly with all her might, as though she had suddenly waked up. "Go along! Go along! Overtake him! Don't leave him for a minute! Go along! Go along!" She pulled me forcibly away from Mother. "Oh, I shall run myself!" "Arkasha! Oh, run after him! Make haste!" Mother cried suddenly, too. I ran off full speed through the kitchen and through the yard, but there was no sign of him anywhere. In the distance I saw black shadows in the darkness. I ran after them and examined each passer-by carefully as I overtook them. So I ran on to the crossroads. "People are not angry with the insane," suddenly flashed through my mind, but Tatiana was wild with rage at him. So he's not mad at all. Oh, it seemed to me all the time that it was symbolic, and that he was bent on putting an end to everything as he did to the icon, and showing that to us, to Mother and all. But that second self was unmistakably beside him too. Of that there could be no doubt. He was nowhere to be found, however, and I could not run to him. It was difficult to believe that he would have simply gone home. Suddenly an idea flashed upon me, and I rushed off to Anna Andreevna. Anna Andreevna had just returned, and I was shown up at once. I went in, controlling myself as far as I could. Without sitting down, I at once described to her the scene which had just taken place, that is, the second self. I shall never forget the greedy but pitilessly composed and self-complacent curiosity with which she listened, also standing, and I shall never forgive her for it. "Where is he? Perhaps you know?" I ended insistently. "Tatiana Pavlovna sent me to you yesterday." I sent for you too yesterday. Yesterday he was at Tsarskoe Selo. He came to see me too, and now," she looked at her watch, "now it is 7 o'clock, so he's pretty sure to be at home." "I see that you know all about it, so tell me, tell me," I cried. "I know a good deal, but I don't know everything. Of course, there's no reason to conceal it from you." She scanned me with a strange glance, smiling and as though deliberating. "Yesterday morning, in answer to her letter, he made Katerina Nikolaevna a formal offer of marriage." "That's false," I said, opening my eyes wide. "The letter went through my hands. I took it to her myself, unopened. This time he behaved chivalrously and concealed nothing from me." "Anna Andreyevna, I can't understand it." "Of course, it's hard to understand it, but it's like a gambler who stakes his last crown while he has a loaded pistol ready in his pocket. That's what his offer amounts to. It's 10 to 1 she won't accept his offer, but still he's reckoning on that 10th chance, and I confess that's very curious. I imagine, though, that it may be a case of frenzy, that second self, as you said so well just now." "And you laugh? And am I really to believe that the letter was given through you? Why, you are the fiancée of her father. Spare me, Anna Andreyevna." "He asked me to sacrifice my future to his happiness. Though he didn't really ask it, it was all done rather silently. I simply read it all in his eyes. Oh, my goodness, what will he do next? Why, he went to Königsberg to ask your mother's leave to marry Katerina Nikolaevna's stepdaughter. That's very like his pitching on me for his go-between and confidant yesterday." She was rather pale, but her calmness was only exaggerated sarcasm. Oh, I forgave her much then, as I began to grasp the position. For a minute I pondered. She waited in silence. "Do you know?" I laughed suddenly. "You delivered the letter because there was not the slightest risk for you, because there's no chance of a marriage. But what of him? Of her, too? Of course she will reject his offer, and then, what may not happen then? Where is he now, Anna Andreyevna?" I cried. "Every minute is precious now. Any minute there may be trouble." "He is at home. I have told you so. In the letter to Katerina Nikolaevna, which I delivered, he asked her in any case to grant him an interview in his lodgings today at 7 o'clock this evening. She promised." "She's going to his lodging? How can that be?" "Why not? The lodging is Darya Onisimovna's. They might very well meet there as her guests." "But she's afraid of him. He may kill her." Anna Andreyevna only smiled. In spite of the terror which I detected in her myself, Katerina Nikolaevna has always from the first cherished a certain reverence and admiration for the nobility of Andrei Petrovitch's principles and the loftiness of his mind. She is trusting herself to him this once, so as to have done with him forever. In his letter, he gave her the most solemn and chivalrous promise that she should have nothing to fear. In short, I don't remember the words of the letter, but she trusted herself, so to speak, for the last time, and, so to speak, responding with the same heroic feelings. There may have been a sort of chivalrous rivalry on both sides. "But the second self! The second self!" I exclaimed. "Besides, he's out of his mind." Yesterday, when she gave her promise to grant him an interview, Katerina Nikolaevna probably did not conceive of the possibility of that. I suddenly turned and was rushing out, to him, to them, of course, but from the next room I ran back for a second. "But perhaps that is just what would suit you, that he should kill her," I cried, and ran out of the house. I was shaking all over as though in a fit, but I went into the lodging quietly, through the kitchen, and asked in a whisper to see Darya Onisimovna. She came out at once and fastened a gaze of intense curiosity upon me. "His Honor, he is not at home." But in a rapid whisper I explained bluntly and exactly that I knew all about it from Anna Andreevna, and that I had just come from her. "Darya Onisimovna, where are they?" "They are in the room where you sat the day before yesterday at the table." "Darya Onisimovna, let me go in." "That's impossible." "Not in there, but in the next room. Darya Onisimovna, Anna Andreevna wishes it, perhaps. If she didn't wish it, she wouldn't have told me herself. They won't hear me. She wishes it herself." "And if she doesn't wish it?" said Darya Onisimovna, her eyes still riveted upon me. "Darya Onisimovna, I remember your Olya. Let me in." Her lips and chin suddenly began to quiver. "Dear friend, for Olya's sake, for the sake of your feeling, don't desert Anna Andreevna. My dear, you won't desert her, will you? You won't desert her?" "No, I won't." "Give me your solemn promise you won't rush out upon them, and won't call out if I hide you in there?" "I swear on my honor, Darya Onisimovna." She took me by my coat, led me into a dark room, next to the one where they were sitting, guided me almost noiselessly over the soft carpet to the doorway, stationed me at the curtain that hung over it, and lifting the curtain a fraction of an inch, showed me them both. I remained. She went away. Of course I remained. I knew that I was eavesdropping, spying on other people's secrets, but I remained. How could I help remaining with the thought of this second self in my mind? Why, he had smashed the icon before my eyes. They were sitting facing one another at the table at which we had yesterday drunk to his resurrection. I got a good view of their faces. She was wearing a simple black dress, and was as beautiful and apparently calm as always. He was speaking. She was listening with intense and sympathetic attention. Perhaps there was some trace of timidity in her, too. He was terribly excited. I had come in the middle of their conversation, and so for some time I could make nothing of it. I remember she suddenly asked, "And I was the cause?" "No, I was the cause," he answered, "and you were only innocently guilty. You know that there are the innocently guilty. Those are generally the most unpardonable crimes, and they almost always bring their punishment," he added, laughing strangely. "And I actually thought for a moment that I had forgotten you and could laugh at my stupid passion. But you know that. What is he to me, though, that man you're going to marry? Yesterday I made you an offer. Forgive me for it. It was absurd, and yet I had no alternative but that. What could I have done but that absurd thing? I don't know." As he said this, he laughed hopelessly, suddenly lifting his eyes to her. Till then he had looked away as he talked. If I had been in her place, I should have been frightened at that laugh. I felt that. He suddenly got up from his chair. "Tell me, how could you consent to come here?" he asked suddenly, as though remembering the real point. "My invitation and my whole letter was absurd." Stay, I can quite imagine how it came to pass that you consented to come, but why did you come? That's the question. Can you have come simply from fear?" "I came to see you," she said, looking at him with timid caution. Both were silent for half a minute. Verselov sank back in his chair, and in a voice soft but almost trembling and full of intense feeling, began. "It's so terribly long since I've seen you, Katerina Nikolaevna, so long that I scarcely thought it possible I should ever be sitting beside you again as I now am, looking into your face and listening to your voice. For 2 years we've not seen each other. For 2 years we've not talked. I never thought to speak to you again. But so be it. What is past, and what is will vanish like smoke tomorrow. So be it. I assent because there is no alternative again. But don't let your coming be in vain," he added suddenly, almost imploringly. "Since you have shown me this charity and have come, don't let it be in vain. Answer me one question." "What question?" "You know we shall never see each other again, and what is it to you? Tell me the truth for once, and answer me one question which sensible people never ask. Did you ever love me, or was I mistaken?" She flushed crimson. "I did love you," she brought out. I expected she would say that. Oh, always truthful, always sincere, always honest. "And now," he went on, "I don't love you now." "And you are laughing?" "No, I laughed just now by accident, because I knew you would ask. And now?" And I smiled at that, because when one guesses right, one always does smile. It seemed quite strange to me. I had never seen her so much on her guard, almost timid, indeed, and embarrassed. His eyes devoured her. "I know that you don't love me, and you don't love me at all?" "Perhaps not at all. I don't love you," she added firmly, without smiling or flushing. "Yes, I did love you, but not for long. I very soon got over it." I know. You saw that it was not what you wanted. But what do you want? Explain that once more." "Have I ever explained that to you? What do I want? Why, I'm the most ordinary woman. I'm a peaceful person. I like cheerful people." "Cheerful?" "You see, I don't know even how to talk to you. I believe that if you could have loved me less, I should have loved you then." She smiled timidly again. The most absolute sincerity was transparent in her answer, and was it possible she did not realize that her answer was the most final summing up of their relations, explaining everything? Oh, how well he must have understood that! But he looked at her and smiled strangely. "Is boring a cheerful person?" he went on questioning her. "He ought not to trouble you at all," she answered with some haste. "I'm marrying him simply because with him I shall be most at peace. My whole heart remains in my own keeping." "They say that you have grown fond of society, of the fashionable world again." "Not fond of it. I know that there is just the same disorderliness in good society as everywhere else, but the outer forms are still attractive, so that if one lives only to pass the time, one can do it better there than anywhere." "I've often heard the word disorderliness of late. You used to be afraid of my disorderliness too. Chains, ideas, and imbecilities." "No, it was not quite that." "What then, for God's sake? Tell me all, frankly." "Well, I'll tell you frankly, for I look on you as a man of great intellect. I always felt there was something ridiculous about you." When she had said this, she suddenly flushed crimson, as though she feared she had said something fearfully indiscreet. "For what you have just said, I can forgive you a great deal," he commented strangely. "I hadn't finished," she said hurriedly, still flushing. "It's I who am ridiculous to talk to you like a fool." "No, you are not ridiculous. You are only a depraved, worldly woman," he said, turning horribly white. "I did not finish either, when I asked you why you had come. Would you like me to finish? There is a document, a letter in existence, and you are awfully afraid of it, because if that letter comes into your father's hands, he may curse you and cut you out of his will. You're afraid of that letter, and you've come for that letter," he brought out. He was shaking all over, and his teeth were almost chattering. She listened to him with a despondent and pained expression of face. "I know that you can do all sorts of things to harm me," she said, as if warding off his words, "but I have come not so much to persuade you not to persecute me, as to see you yourself. I've been wanting to meet you very much for a long time. But I find you just the same as ever," she added suddenly, as though carried away by a special and striking thought, and even by some strange sudden emotion. "Did you hope to see me different after my letter about your depravity? Tell me, did you come here without any fear?" "I came because I once loved you. But do you know, I beg you not to threaten me, please, with anything. While we are now together, don't remind me of my evil thoughts and feelings. If you could talk to me of something else, I should be very glad. Let threats come afterwards, but it should be different now. I came really to see you for a minute and to hear you. Oh, well, if you can't help it, kill me straight off. Only don't threaten me, and don't torture yourself before me," she concluded, looking at him in strange expectation, as though she really thought he might kill her. He got up from his seat again, and looking at her with glowing eyes, said resolutely, "While you are here, you will suffer not the slightest annoyance." "Oh, yes, your word of honor," she said, smiling. "No, not only because I gave my word of honor in my letter, but because I want to think of you all night." "To torture yourself?" "I picture you in my mind whenever I'm alone. I do nothing but talk to you. I go into some squalid, dirty hole, and as a contrast you appear to me at once. But you always laugh at me as you do now." He said this as though he were beside himself. "I have never laughed at you, never!" she exclaimed in a voice full of feeling, and with a look of the greatest compassion in her face. "In coming here, I tried my utmost to do it so that you should have no reason to be mortified," she added suddenly. "I came here to tell you that I almost love you. Forgive me, perhaps I used the wrong words," she went on hurriedly. He laughed. "How is it you cannot dissemble? Why is it you are such a simple creature? Why is it you're not like all the rest? Why, how can you tell a man you are turning away that you almost love him?" "It's only that I could not express myself," she put in hurriedly. "I used the wrong words. It's because I've always felt abashed and unable to talk to you from the first time I met you. And if I used the wrong words, saying that I almost love you, in my thought it was almost so. So that's why I said so, though I love you with that, well, with that general love with which one loves everyone and which one is never ashamed to own." He listened in silence, fixing his glowing eyes upon her. "I am offending you, of course," he went on, as though beside himself. "This must really be what they call passion. All I know is that in your presence I am done for, in your absence too. It's just the same whether you are there or not. Wherever you may be, you are always before me. I know, too, that I can hate you intensely, more than I can love you. But I've long given up thinking about anything now. It's all the same to me. I am only sorry I should love a woman like you." His voice broke. He went on, as it were, gasping for breath. "What is it to you? You think it wild of me to talk like that." He smiled a pale smile. "I believe, if only that would charm you, I would be ready to stand for 30 years like a post on one leg. I see you are sorry for me. Your face says I would love you if I could, but I can't. Yes? Never mind. I've no pride. I'm ready to take any charity from you like a beggar. Do you hear? A beggar has no pride." She got up and went to him. "Dear friend," she said, with inexpressible feeling in her face, touching his shoulder with her hand, "I can't hear you talk like that. I shall think of you all my life as someone most precious, great-hearted, as something most sacred of all that I respect and love. Andrei Petrovitch, understand what I say. Why, it's not for nothing I've come here now, dear friend. Dear to me then and now. I shall never forget how deeply you stirred my mind when first we met. Let us part as friends, and you will be for me the most earnest and dearest thought in my whole life." "Let us part, and then I will love you. I will love you, only let us part. Listen," he brought out, perfectly white. "Grant me one charity more. Don't love me. Don't live with me. Let us never meet. I will be your slave if you summon me, and I will vanish at once if you don't want to see me or hear me. Only don't marry anyone." It sent a pang to my heart to hear those words. That naively humiliating entreaty was the more pitiful, the more heartrending for being so flagrant and impossible. Yes, indeed, he was asking charity. Could he imagine she would consent? Yet he had humbled himself to put it to the test. He had tried entreating her. This depth of spiritual degradation was insufferable to watch. Every feature in her face seemed suddenly distorted with pain, but before she had time to utter a word, he suddenly realized what he had done. "I will strangle you," he said suddenly, in a strange, distorted voice unlike his own. But she answered him strangely too, and she too spoke in a different voice, unlike her own. "If I granted you charity," she said with sudden firmness, "you would punish me for it afterwards worse than you threaten me now, for you would never forget that you stood before me as a beggar. I can't listen to threats from you," she added, looking at him with indignation, almost defiance. "Threats from you? You mean from such a beggar? I was joking," he said softly, smiling. "I won't touch you. Don't be afraid. Go away, and I'll do my utmost to send you that letter. Only go, go. I wrote you a stupid letter, and you answered my stupid letter in kind by coming. We are quits. This is your way." He pointed towards the door. She was moving towards the room in which I was standing behind the curtain. "Forgive me if you can," she said, stopping in the doorway. "What if we meet some day, quite friends, and recall this scene with laughter?" he said suddenly. But His face was quivering all over like the face of a man in convulsions. "Oh, God grant we may!" she cried, clasping her hands, though she watched his face timidly, as though trying to guess what he meant. "Go along. Much sense we have, the pair of us, but oh, you are one of my own kind. I wrote you a mad letter, and you agreed to come to tell me that you almost love me. Yes, we are possessed by the same madness. Be always as mad. Don't change, and we shall meet as friends. That I predict. That I swear. And then I shall certainly love you, for I feel that even now." The woman in her could not resist flinging those last words to him from the doorway. She went out. With noiseless haste I went into the kitchen, and scarcely glancing at Darya Onisimovna, who was waiting for me, I went down the back staircase and across the yard into the street. But I had only time to see her get into the sledge that was waiting for her at the steps. I ran down the street. End of Part 3, Chapter 10. Recording by Linda Johnson. Part 3, Chapter 11 of A Raw Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Raw Youth by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated by Constance Garnett. Part 3, Chapter 11. I ran to Lambert. Oh, how I should have liked to give a show of logic to my behavior, and to find some trace of common sense in my actions that evening and all that night. But even now, when I can reflect on it all, I am utterly unable to present my conduct in any clear and logical connection. It was a case of feeling, or rather a perfect chaos of feelings, in the midst of which I was naturally bound to go astray. It is true there was one dominant feeling, which mastered me completely and overwhelmed all the others, but need I confess to it? Especially as I am not certain. I ran to Lambert, beside myself, of course. I positively scared Alphonsine and him for the first minute. I have always noticed that even the most profligate, most degraded Frenchmen are in their domestic life extremely given to a sort of bourgeois routine, a sort of very prosaic daily ceremonial of life established once and forever. Lambert quickly realized, however, that something had happened, and was delighted that I had come to him at last, and that I was in his clutches. He had been thinking of nothing else day and night. Oh, how badly he needed me! And behold now, when he had lost all hope, I had suddenly appeared, of my own accord, and in such a frantic state, just the state which suited him. "Lambert, wine!" I cried. "Let's drink! Let's have a jolly time! Alphonsine, where's your guitar?" I won't describe the scene, it's unnecessary. We drank, and I told him all about it, everything. He listened greedily. I openly, of my own accord, suggested a plot, a general flare-up. To begin with, we were by letter to ask Katerina Nikolaevna to come to us. "That's possible," Lambert assented, gloating over every word I said. "Secondly, we must send a copy of the document in full, that she might see at once that she was not being deceived." "That's right, that's what we must do," Lambert agreed, continually exchanging glances with Alphonsine. Thirdly, Lambert must ask her to come, writing as though he were an unknown person and had just arrived from Moscow, and I must bring Versilov. "And we might have Versilov, too," Lambert assented. "Not might, but must," I cried. It's essential. It's for his sake it's all being done, I explained, taking one sip after another from my glass. We were all three drinking, while I believe I really drank the whole bottle of champagne, while they only made a show of drinking. Versaloff and I will sit in the next room. Lambert would have to take the next room. And suddenly, when she had agreed to everything, to paying the cash, and to his other demands too, for all women were abject creatures, then Versaloff and I would come in and convict her of being abject, and Versaloff, seeing what a horrid woman she was, would at once be cured, and reject her with scorn. Only we ought to have Boering, too, that he might see her put to shame. No, we don't want Boering, Lambert observed. We do, I yelled again. You don't know anything about it, Lambert, for you are a fool. On the contrary, let it make a scandal in fashionable society. It will be our revenge on fashionable society, and upon her, and let her be punished. Lambert, she will give you an IOU. I don't want money, I don't care a damn for money. But you can stoop to pick it up and stuff it in your pocket, and might curse with it. But I shall crush her. Yes, Lambert kept approving. You are right there. He kept exchanging glances with Alphonsine. Lambert, she has an awful reverence for Versaloff. I saw that for certain just now, I babbled to him. It's a good thing you did peep and see it all. I should never have thought that you would have made such a good spy, and that you had so much sense. He said this to flatter me. That's a lie, Frenchman. I'm not a spy, but I have plenty of sense. And do you know, Lambert, she loves him, really. I went on, making desperate efforts to express myself. But she won't marry him, because Boering's an officer in the Guards, and Versaloff is only a noble-hearted man, and a friend of humanity. To their thinking, a comic person, and nothing else. Oh, she understands his passion and gloats over it, flirts, is carried away by it, but won't marry him. She's a woman. She's a serpent. Every woman is a serpent, and every serpent is a woman. He must be cured. We must tear the scales off his eyes. Let him see what she is, and be cured. I will bring him to you, Lambert. Just so, Lambert kept repeating, filling up my glass every minute. He was in a perfect tremble of anxiety to avoid contradicting or offending me, and to make me go on drinking. It was so coarse and obvious that even at the time I could not help noticing it. But nothing could have made me go away. I kept drinking and talking, and was desperately anxious to give full expression to what I was feeling. When Lambert brought in another bottle, Alphonsine was playing some Spanish air on the guitar. I was almost in tears. "Lambert, do you know everything?" I exclaimed with intense feeling. "That man must be saved, for he's spellbound by sorcery. If she were to marry him, he would spurn her from him the day after the wedding. For that does happen sometimes. For such a wild, outrageous love is like a fit, like a deadly noose, like an illness, and as soon as it is gratified, the scales fall from the eyes at once, and the opposite feeling comes, loathing and hatred, the desire to strangle, to crush. Do you know the story of A Visage, Lambert? Have you read it?" "No, I don't remember. A novel?" muttered Lambert. "Oh, you know nothing, Lambert. You're fearfully, fearfully ignorant. But I don't care a damn for that. It's no matter. Oh, he loves mother. He kissed her portrait. He'll spurn that woman next morning and come back to mother of himself. But then it will be too late. So we must save him now." In the end I began crying bitterly, But I still went on talking and drank a fearful quantity of champagne. It was most characteristic of Lambert that all that evening he did not once ask about the document, where it was, that I should show it, should put it on the table. What would have been more natural than to inquire about it, since we were planning to take action? Another point. We kept saying that we must do this, that we certainly would do this. But of the place, the time, and manner, we did not say a word. He only assented to all I said, and kept looking at Alphonsine. That was all. Of course, I was incapable of reflecting on that at the time, but I remember it. I ended by falling asleep on his sofa without undressing. I slept a long time, and waked up very late. I remember that after waking, I lay for a long time on the sofa, as it were petrified, trying to reflect and remember, and pretending that I was still asleep. But it appeared that Lambert was not in the room. He had gone out. It was past 9 o'clock. The stove had been heated and was crackling exactly as it had done when I found myself the first time at Lambert's after that night. But Alphonsine was behind the screen keeping guard on me. I noticed it at once, for she had twice peeped out and glanced at me, but each time I shut my eyes and pretended to be asleep. I did this because I was overwhelmed and wanted to think over my position. I felt with horror all the ineptitude and loathsomeness of my confession to Lambert, my plotting with him, the blunder I had made in running to him. But, thank God, the letter was still in my keeping. It was still sewn up in my side pocket. I felt with my hand. It was there. So all I had to do was to get up and run away. I need not care what Lambert thought of me afterwards. Lambert was not worth it. But I was ashamed of myself. I was my own judge, and, my God, what was there in my heart? But there's no need to describe that hellish, insufferable feeling, and that consciousness of filth and vileness. But yet I must confess it, for I feel the time has come. It must be recorded in my story. So let it be known that I meant to shame her, and planned to be almost a witness of her yielding to Lambert's demands. Oh, the baseness! Not for the sake of saving Versaloff in his madness and bringing him back to mother, but perhaps because I was myself in love and jealous. Jealous of whom? Of Boring? Of Versaloff? Of anyone she might look at or talk to at a ball, while I should be standing in a corner, ashamed of myself. Oh, the hideousness of it! In short, I don't know of whom I was jealous on her account, but all I felt and knew the evening before was that, as certainly as twice two make four, she was lost to me. That woman would spurn me and laugh at me for falseness and absurdity. She was truthful and honest, while I was a spy, using letters to threaten her. All this I have kept hidden in my heart ever since, but now the day has come, and I make up my account, but again for the last time. Perhaps fully half, or perhaps even 75% of what I am saying is a libel upon myself. That night I hated her in a kind of delirium, and afterwards like a drunken rowdy. I have said already that it was a chaos of feelings and sensations, in which I could distinguish nothing clearly myself. But still I have had to confess it, for though only a part of what I felt, it was certainly present. With an overpowering sense of disgust, and a firm determination to cancel all that had happened, I suddenly jumped up from the sofa, but as I jumped up, Alphonsine instantly popped out. I seized my overcoat and cap, and told her to tell Lambert that I had been raving the evening before, that I had slandered a woman, that I had been joking, and that Lambert must not dare come near me again. All this I expressed in a blundering fashion, talking hurriedly in French, and of course anything but clearly, but to my surprise, Alphonsine understood everything perfectly, and what was most surprising of all, she seemed positively relieved at something. "Oui, oui," she said approvingly. "C'est une honte. Une dame. Oh, vous êtes généreux, vous. Soyez tranquille. Je ferai voir raison à Lambert." So that I was even at that moment puzzled to explain the sudden change in her attitude, and consequently, I suppose, in Lambert's. I went away, however, saying nothing. All was in confusion within me, and I was hardly capable of reasoning. Oh, afterwards I could explain it all, but then it was too late. Oh, what a hellish plot it was! I will pause here and explain it beforehand, as otherwise it will be impossible for the reader to understand it. The fact was that at my very first interview with Lambert, when I was thawing in his lodging, I had muttered to him like a fool that the letter was sewn up in my pocket. Then I had suddenly fallen asleep for a time on the sofa in the corner, and Lambert had promptly felt my pocket and was convinced that there was a piece of paper sewn up in it. Several times afterwards he made sure that the paper was still there. When we were dining, for instance, at the Tatars, I remember that he several times put his arms round my waist on purpose. Grasping the importance of the letter, he made a separate plan of his own, of which I had no suspicion at all. I, like a fool, imagined all the time that he urged me to come home so persistently, to get me to join his gang and to act only in concert with him. But alas! He invited me with quite a different object. He wanted to make me dead drunk, and when I was stretched, snoring and unconscious, to rip open my pocket and take possession of the letter. This was precisely what he and Alphonsine had done that night. Alphonsine had unpicked the pocket, taking out the letter, her letter, the document I had brought from Moscow. They had taken a piece of plain notepaper the same size, put it in the pocket, and sewn it up again as if nothing had happened, so that I might notice no difference. Alphonsine had sewn it up, and I, up to the very end, for another day and a half, still went on believing that I was in possession of the secret, and that Katerina Nikolaevna's fate was still in my hands. A last word. That theft of the letter was the cause of everything and of all the other disasters that followed. The last 24 hours of my story have come, and I am at the end. It was, I believe, about 10:30, when, excited and, as far as I remember, strangely absent-minded, but with a firm determination in my heart, I dragged myself to my lodgings. I was not in a hurry. I knew how I was going to act. And scarcely had I stepped into the passage when I realized at once that a new calamity had occurred, and an extraordinary complication had arisen. The old prince had just been brought from Tsarskoe Sielo and was in the flat. With him was Anna Andreevna. He had been put, not in my room, but in the 2 rooms next to mine that had been occupied by my landlord and his wife. The day before, as it appeared, some changes and improvements had been made in the room, but only of the most superficial kind. The landlord and his wife had moved into the little room of the whimsical lodger marked with smallpox, whom I have mentioned already, and that individual had been temporarily banished I don't know where. I was met by the landlord, who at once whisked into my room. He looked less sure of his ground than he had done the evening before, but was in an unusual state of excitement, so to say, at the climax of the affair. I said nothing to him, but, moving aside into a corner, and clutching my head in my hands, I stood so for a moment. He thought for the first moment that I was putting it on, but at last his fortitude gave way, and he could not help being scared. "Can anything be wrong?" he muttered. "I've been waiting for you to ask," he added, seeing I did not answer, "whether you preferred that door to be opened, so that you may have direct access to the prince's rooms, instead of going by the passage?" He pointed to the door at the side, always locked, which led to the landlord's rooms, now the old prince's apartments. "Look here, Pyotr Ippolitovitch," I turned to him with a stern air. "I humbly beg you to go to Anna Andreyevna and ask her to come here at once to discuss the situation. Have they been here long?" "Going on for an hour." "Go and fetch her, then." He went and brought the strange reply that Anna Andreyevna and Prince Nikolay Ivanitch were impatiently expecting me in the next room. So Anna Andreyevna would not come. I smoothed out my coat, which was creased from sleeping in it that night, brushed it, washed, combed my hair. I did all this deliberately, realizing how necessary it was to be careful, and I went in to the old prince. The prince was sitting on the sofa at a round table, and Anna Andreyevna in another corner at another table covered with a cloth, on which the landlady's samovar, polished as it had never been before, was boiling for tea. I walked in with the same stern look on my face, and the old man instantly noticed this and winced, and the smile on his face was instantly replaced by a look of terror, but I could not keep it up. I instantly laughed and held out my hands to him. The poor old fellow simply flung himself into my arms. I realized unmistakably at once the condition of the man I had to deal with. To begin with, it was as clear as 2 make 4 that in the interval since I had seen him last, they had turned the old man, till lately almost hale, and to some extent rational, and not altogether without will-power, into a sort of mummy, a scared and mistrustful child. I may add, he quite knew why they had brought him here, and everything had been done as I have explained already. He was suddenly shocked, crushed, and overwhelmed by being told of his daughter's treachery and of a possible madhouse. He had allowed himself to be carried off, so scared that he hardly knew what he was doing. He was told that I was in possession of the secret, and that I had the proof that would establish the fact conclusively. I may mention at once, it was just that proof that would establish the fact which he dreaded more than anything in the world. He was expecting me to go in to him with a sort of death sentence in my face and a document in my hand, and was immensely delighted that I was ready meanwhile to laugh and chatter of other things. While we were embracing, he shed tears. I must confess I shed a tear also. I felt suddenly very sorry for him. Alphonsine's little lapdog broke into a bark as shrill as a bell, and made dashes at me from the sofa. He had not parted from this tiny dog since he had had it, and even slept with it. "Oh, je disais qu'il a de cœur," he exclaimed, indicating me to Anna Andreyevna. "But how much stronger you look, Prince! How well and fresh and strong you look!" I observed. Alas, it was just the opposite. He looked like a mummy, and I only said it to cheer him up. "N'est-ce pas? N'est-ce pas?" he repeated joyfully. "Oh, I've regained my health wonderfully." "But drink your tea, and if you'll give me a cup, I'll drink some with you." "That's delightful. Let us drink the cup that cheers," or how does it go? That's in some poem. Anna Andreyevna, give him some tea. Il prend toujours par les sentiments. Give us some tea, my dear. Anna Andreyevna poured out the tea, but suddenly turning to me, began with extreme solemnity. "Arkady Makarovitch, we both, my benefactor, Prince Nikolay Ivanitch, and I, have taken refuge with you. I consider that we have come to you alone, and we both beg of you to shelter us. Remember that the whole fate of this saintly, this noble and injured man is in your hands. We await the decision and count upon the justice of your heart." But she could not go on. The old prince was reduced to terror and almost trembling with alarm. "Après, après, n'est-ce pas, chère amie?" he kept repeating, holding out his hands to her. I cannot express how disagreeably her outburst impressed me. I made no response, but a chilly and dignified bow. Then I sat down to the table, and with undisguised intention began talking of other things, of various trifles, laughing and making jokes. The old man was evidently grateful to me, and was enthusiastically delighted. But enthusiastic as his gaiety was, it was evidently insincere, and might any moment have been followed by absolute dejection. That was clear from the first glance. "Cher enfant, I hear you've been ill. Ah, pardon, I hear you've been busy with spiritualism all this time." "I never thought of such a thing," I said, smiling. "No? Who was it told me about spiritualism?" "It was your landlord here, Pyotr Ippolitovitch," Anna Andreyevna explained. "He's a very amusing man, and knows a great many anecdotes. Shall I ask him in?" "Oui, oui, il est charmant. He knows anecdotes, but better send for him later." "We'll send for him, and he'll tell us stories. Mais après. Only fancy, they were laying the table just now, and he said, 'Don't be uneasy, it won't fly about. We are not spiritualists.' Is it possible that the tables fly about among the spiritualists?" "I really don't know. They say so. They say they jump right off the ground." "Mais c'est terrible ce que tu dis." He looked at me in alarm. "Oh, don't be uneasy. Of course that's nonsense." "That's what I say, too. Nastasia Stepanovna Salomeyev. You know her, of course." "Oh, no, you don't know her." "Would you believe it, she believes in spiritualism, too? And only fancy, chère enfant," he turned to Anna Andreyevna. "I said to her, there are tables in the Ministry of Finance, and 8 pairs of clerks' hands are lying on them, writing all the while. So why is it the tables don't dance there? Fancy if they suddenly all began dancing. The revolt of the tables in the Ministry of Finance or Popular Education. That's the last straw." "What charming things you say, Prince, just as you always did," I exclaimed, trying to laugh as genuinely as possible. "N'est-ce pas? Je ne parle pas trop, mais je dis bien." "I will bring Pyotr Ippolitovitch," Anna Andreyevna said, getting up. There was a gleam of pleasure in her face. She was relieved at seeing how affectionate I was with the old prince. But she had hardly gone out when the old man's face changed instantly. He looked hurriedly at the door, glanced about him, and stooping towards me from the sofa, whispered to me in a frightened voice, "Cher ami! Oh, if I could see them both here together! Oh, cher enfant!" "Prince, don't distress yourself." "Yes, yes, but we'll reconcile them, n'est-ce pas? It's a foolish, petty quarrel between two most estimable women, n'est-ce pas? You are my only hope. We'll set everything straight here, and what a queer place this is!" He looked about him almost fearfully. "And that landlord, you know, he's got such a face. Tell me, he's not dangerous?" "The landlord? Oh, no, how could he be dangerous?" "C'est ça, so much the better. Il semble qu'il est bête, ce gentilhomme. Cher enfant, for Christ's sake, don't tell Anna Andreevna that I'm afraid of everything here. I praised everything from the first moment. I praised the landlord, too. Listen, do you know the story of what happened to Vincent? Do you remember?" "Well, what of it?" "Rien, rien du tout. Mais je suis libre ici, n'est-ce pas? What do you think? Nothing could happen to me here of the same sort?" "But I assure you, dear Prince, upon my word—" "Mon ami, mon enfant!" he exclaimed suddenly, clasping his hands before him, not seeking to disguise his alarm. "If you really have something, some document, in fact, if you have something to say to me, don't say it. For God's sake, don't say anything at all. Put it off as long as you can." He was on the point of throwing himself in my arms. Tears were flowing down his face. I cannot describe how it made my heart ache. The poor old man was like a pitiful, frightened child, stolen from his home by gypsies and carried away to live with strangers, but we were not allowed to embrace. The door opened, and Anna Andreevna walked in, not with the landlord, but with her brother, the Kammerjunker. This new surprise petrified me. I got up and was making for the door. "Arkady Makarovitch, allow me to introduce you," Anna Andreevna said aloud, so that I was compelled to stop. "I know your brother too well already," I rapped out, laying special emphasis on the word too. "Ah, that was a terrible blunder, and I'm so sorry, dear. And Andrei Makarovitch," the young man began lisping, coming up to me with an extraordinarily free and easy air, and seizing my hand, which I was incapable of withdrawing. "It was all the fault of my Stepan. He announced you so stupidly that I mistook you for someone else. That was in Moscow," he explained to his sister. "Afterwards I did everything I could to look you up and explain, but I was ill. Ask her. Cher Prince, nous devons être amis, même par droit de naissance." And the impudent young man had the effrontery to put his arm round my shoulder, which was the height of familiarity. I drew back, but overcome by embarrassment, preferred to beat a hasty retreat without saying a word. Going back to my room, I sat down on my bed in uncertainty and agitation. I felt suffocated by the atmosphere of intrigue, but I could not deal Anna Andreevna such a direct and crushing blow. I suddenly felt that she too was dear to me, and that her position was an awful one. As I had expected, she came into my room herself, leaving the prince with her brother, who immediately began telling him some society scandal as fresh as hot cakes, which at once distracted the impressionable old man's attention and cheered him up. I got up from the bed in silence, with a look of inquiry. "I have told you everything, Arkady Makarovitch," she began directly. "Our fate is in your hands." "But I told you beforehand that I cannot—" The most sacred duties prevent me doing what you desire." "Yes? Is that your answer? Well, let me perish. But what of the old prince? What do you expect? Why, he'll be out of his mind by the evening." "No, he'll go out of his mind if I show him the letter in which his daughter writes to a lawyer about certifying him insane," I cried with heat. "That's what would be too much for him. Do you know he won't believe that letter? He's told me so already." I lied, saying he had said this of the letter, but it was effective. "He has says so already? I thought so. In that case I'm lost. He's been crying already and asking to go home." "Tell me, what's your plan exactly?" I asked insistently. She flushed from exasperated haughtiness, so to speak, but she controlled herself. "With that letter of his daughter's in our hands, we are justified in the eyes of the world. I should send it at once to Prince V and to Boris Mihalovich Pelestchev, the friends of his childhood, both persons highly respected and influential in society. And I know that some years ago they were indignant with the conduct of his greedy and merciless daughter. They will, of course, reconcile him with his daughter at my request. I shall insist on it myself. But the position of affairs will be completely changed. And my relations, too, the Fanaryatovs, will, I judge, make up their minds to support my rights. But what weighs most with me is his happiness. I want him to understand and appreciate who is really devoted to him. Of course, I've always reckoned most on your influence with him, Arkady Makarovitch. You are so fond of him. And who does care for him except you and me? He has done nothing but talk about you these last few days. He was pining for you, his young friend. I need not say that for the rest of my life my gratitude will be unmeasured." She was actually promising me a reward. Money, perhaps. I interrupted her sharply. "Whatever you say, I cannot," I brought out with an air of immovable determination. "I can only repay you with equal frankness and explain my final decision. I shall, at the earliest possible moment, put this fatal letter into Katerina Nikolaevna's hands, but only on condition that all that has happened shall not be made a scandal, and that she gives me her word beforehand that she will not interfere with your happiness. That's all that I can do." "That's impossible," she said, flushing all over. The mere idea that Katerina Nikolaevna would spare her roused her to indignation. "I shall not change, Anna Andreevna." "Perhaps you will change." "You had better apply to Lambert." "Arkady Makarovitch, you don't know what misery may come from your obstinacy," she said with grim exasperation. "Misery will follow, that's true. My head is going round. I've had enough of you. I've made up my mind, and that's the end of it. Only I beg you, for God's sake, don't bring your brother in to me." "But he is very anxious to make up for—" "There is nothing to make up for. I don't want it. I don't wish for it. I don't wish for it," I exclaimed, clutching my head. Oh, perhaps I treated her too disdainfully then. "Tell me, though, where will the prince sleep tonight? Surely not here." "He will stay the night here, in your flat, and with you." "I am moving into another lodging this evening." And uttering these ruthless words, I seized my cap and began putting on my greatcoat. Anna Andreevna watched me in sullen silence. I felt sorry for her. Oh, I felt sorry for that proud girl. But I rushed out of the flat without leaving her one word of hope. I will try to be brief. My decision was taken beyond recall, and I went straight to Tatiana Pavlovna. Alas, a great calamity might have been averted if I had only found her at home, but as though of design, I was pursued by ill luck all that day. I went, of course, to my mother's, in the first place to see her, and secondly, because I reckoned certainly on meeting Tatiana Pavlovna there. But she was not there either. She had only just gone away, while mother was lying down ill, and Liza was left alone with her. Liza begged me not to go in, and not to wake mother. She has not slept all night. She's so worried. Thank God she has fallen asleep at last. I embraced Liza and said 2 or 3 words to her, telling her I had made an immense and momentous resolution, and should carry it out at once. She listened without particular surprise, as though to the usual thing. Oh, they had all grown used by then to my constantly repeated final resolutions, and the feeble cancelling of them afterwards. But this time it would be a different matter. I went to the eating-house on the canal side, and sat down there to wait a while in the certainty of finding Tatiana Pavlovna afterwards. I must explain, though, why I found it so necessary to see that lady. The fact is that I wanted to send her at once to Katerina Nikolaevna, to ask her to come back with her, meaning in Tatiana Pavlovna's presence to return the letter, explaining everything once for all. In short, I wanted nothing but what was fitting. I wanted to put myself right once and for all. At the same time, I was quite determined to put in a few words on behalf of Anna Andreevna, and, if possible, to take Katerina Nikolaevna, together with Tatiana Pavlovna, by way of a witness, back with me to see the prince, there to reconcile the hostile ladies, to bring the old prince back to life, and, in fact, in that little group anyway, to make everyone happy on the spot, that very day, so that there would be none left unhappy but Versaloff and mother. I could have no doubt of my success. From gratitude for my restoration of the letter, from which I should ask nothing of her in return, Katerina Nikolaevna would not have refused me such a request. Alas! I still imagined I was in possession of the document. Oh, what a stupid and ignominious position I was in, though without suspecting it. It was getting quite dark, about 4 o'clock, when I called at Tatiana Pavlovna's again. Maria answered gruffly that she had not come in. I remember very well now the strange look Maria gave me from under her brows, but of course it did not strike me at the time. I was suddenly stung by another idea. As I went down the stairs, from Tatiana Pavlovna's, vexed and somewhat dejected, I thought of the poor old prince who had held out his hands to me that morning, and I suddenly reproached myself bitterly for having deserted him, perhaps, indeed, from feeling personally aggrieved. I began uneasily imagining that something really very bad might have happened in my absence, and hurriedly went home. At home, however, all that had been happening was this. When Anna Andreevna had gone out of my room in a rage that morning, she had not yet lost heart. I must mention that she had already that morning sent to Lambert. Then she sent to him again, and as Lambert appeared to be still absent from home, she finally dispatched her brother to look for him. In face of my opposition, the poor girl was resting her last hopes on Lambert and his influence on me. She expected him with impatience, and only wondered that after hovering round her and never leaving her side till that day, he should now have suddenly deserted her and vanished. Alas! She could not possibly have imagined that Lambert, being now in possession of the document, had made entirely different plans, and so, of course, was keeping out of the way and hiding from her on purpose. And so, in her anxiety and growing uneasiness, Anna Andreevna was scarcely capable of entertaining the old man. His uneasiness was growing to threatening proportions. He kept asking strange and timorous questions. He began looking suspiciously at her, and several times fell to weeping. Young Versalov did not stay long. After he had gone, Anna Andreevna was reduced to bringing in Pyotr Ippolitovitch, on whom she was relying. But he did not please the old prince at all, and even aroused his aversion. In fact, the old prince, for some reason, regarded Pyotr Ippolitovitch with increasing distrust and suspicion. As ill luck would have it, the landlord launched again into a disquisition on spiritualism, and described all sorts of tricks which he said he had seen himself at séances. He declared that one medium had, before the whole audience, cut off people's heads, so that blood flowed, and every one saw it, and afterwards put them back on their necks, and that they grew on again, also in the sight of the whole audience, and all this happened in the year 1859. The old prince was so frightened, and at the same time, for some reason, was so indignant, that Anna Andreevna was obliged to get rid of the storyteller promptly. Fortunately, dinner arrived, ordered expressly the evening before from somewhere near, through Lambert and Alphonsine, from a remarkable French cook who was out of a place, and wanted to find a situation in a nobleman's family or a club. The dinner and the champagne that accompanied it greatly cheered the old prince. He ate a great deal, and was very jocose. After dinner, he felt heavy and drowsy, of course, and as he always took a nap after dinner, Anna Andreevna made up a bed for him. He kept kissing her hand as he fell asleep, and declaring that she was his paradise, his hope, his houri, his golden flower. In fact, he dropped into the most oriental expressions. At last he fell asleep, and it was just then I came back. Anna Andreevna came in to me hurriedly, clasped her hands before me, and said that not for her own sake, but for the prince's, she besought me not to go away, but to go in to him as soon as he waked up. "He will be lost without you. He will have a nervous attack. I'm afraid he may break down before night." She added that she herself would be compelled to be away, possibly for a couple of hours, and so she would be leaving the prince in my sole charge. I promised her warmly that I would remain till the evening, and that when the prince waked up, I would do my very best to entertain him. "And I will do my duty," she declared with energy. She went out. I may add, anticipating events, that she went out to look for Lambert herself. This was her last hope. She also went to her brothers, and to her relations, the Fanaryatovs. It may well be understood what her state of mind must have been when she returned. The old prince waked up about an hour after her departure. I heard him groan through the wall, and at once ran in to him. I found him sitting on the bed in his dressing gown, but so terrified by his isolation, the light of the solitary lamp, and the strange room, that when I went in he started, jumped up, and screamed. I flew up to him, and when he recognized me, he began embracing me with tears of joy. "I was told that you had moved into another lodging, that you had taken fright and run away." "Who can have told you that?" "Who could? You see, I may have imagined it myself, or someone may have told me. Only fancy, I've just had a dream. An old man with a beard came in carrying an icon broken in two, and all at once he said, 'So shall your life be broken in two.'" "Good heavens! You must have heard from someone that Versalov broke an icon in two yesterday? N'est-ce pas? I heard so. I heard from Darya Onisimovna yesterday morning. She brought my trunk here, and the dog." "And so you dreamed of it." "Yes, I suppose so. And that old man kept shaking his finger at me. Where is Anna Andreyevna?" "She'll be back directly." "Where from? Has she gone away too?" he exclaimed piteously. "No, no, she'll be here directly, and she asked me to stay with you." "Oui. And so our Andrei Petrovitch has gone off his head so rapidly and unexpectedly. I always predicted that that's how he'd end. Stay, my dear." He suddenly clutched me by the coat and drew me towards him. "The landlord," he whispered, "brought in some photographs just now. Horrid photographs of women, naked women in various oriental poses, and began showing them me in a glass. I admired them, of course, though I did not like them, but you know that's just as they brought horrid women to that poor fellow, so as to make him drunk more easily." "Why, you are talking of Von Saun. But that's enough, Prince. The landlord's a fool and nothing more." "A fool and nothing more. C'est mon opinion. My dear, rescue me from here if you can." He suddenly clasped his hands before me. "Prince, I will do everything I can. I am entirely at your service. Dear Prince, wait a little, and perhaps I will put everything right." "N'est-ce pas? We'll cut and run, and we'll leave my trunk here to look as though we are coming back." "Where should we run to? And what of Anna Andreyevna?" "No, no, we'll go with Anna Andreyevna. Oh, mon cher, there's a regular muddle in my head. Stay, there in my bag on the right is Katya's portrait. I slipped it in on the sly so that Anna Andreyevna, and still more, that Darya Onisimovna should not notice it. Take it out, for goodness' sake, make haste. Be careful, mind we are not caught. Couldn't you fasten the door with the hook?" I did, in fact, find in the bag a photograph of Katerina Nikolaevna in an oval frame. He took it in his hands, carried it to the light, and tears suddenly flowed down his thin yellow cheeks. "C'est un ange, c'est un ange du ciel," he exclaimed. "I never have been as good to her as I ought, and see what's happened now. Cher enfant, I don't believe a word of it, not a word of it. My dear, tell me, can you imagine they are wanting to put me in a madhouse? Je dis des choses charmantes, et tout le monde rit, and all of a sudden they take a man like that to a madhouse." "That's never happened," I cried. "That's a mistake. I know her feelings." "You know her feelings too? That's splendid. My dear, you've given me new life. How could they say things against you? My dear, fetch Katya here, and let them kiss each other before me, and I will take them home, and we'll get rid of the landlord." He stood up, clasped his hands, and fell on his knees before me. "Cher," he whispered, shaking like a leaf in a sort of insane terror, "my dear, tell me the whole truth. Where will they put me now?" "My God," I cried, raising him up and making him sit on the bed, "why, you don't believe in me at last. Do you think that I'm in the plot too? I won't let anyone lay a finger on you." "C'est ça. Don't let them," he faltered, clutching me tightly by the elbow with both hands and still trembling. "Don't let anyone touch me, and don't tell me lies yourself about anything. For will they take me away from here? Listen, that landlord, Hippolyte, or whatever his name is, isn't a doctor?" "A doctor? This isn't a madhouse here in this room?" But at that instant the door opened, and Anna Andreyevna came in. She must have been listening at the door, and could not resist opening the door too suddenly, and the prince, who started at every creak, shrieked and flung himself on his face on the pillow. Finally he had something like a fit, which ended in sobs. "See, this is your doing," I said to her, pointing to the old man. "No, it's your doing." She raised her voice harshly. "I appeal to you for the last time, Arkady Makarovitch. Will you unmask the diabolical intrigue against this defenseless old man, and sacrifice your mad and childish dreams of love to save your own sister?" "I will save you all, but only in the way I told you this morning. I am running off again, and perhaps in an hour Katerina Nikolaevna will be here herself. I will reconcile you all, and you will all be happy," I exclaimed, almost with inspiration. Fetch her here," cried the prince in a flutter. "Take me to her. I want to see Katya and to bless her," he exclaimed, lifting up his hands and springing off the bed. "You see," I said to Anna Andreevna, motioning towards him, "you hear what he says? Now, at all events, no document will be any help to you." "I see, but it might help to justify my conduct in the opinion of the world. As it is, I'm disgraced. Enough. My conscience is clear. I am abandoned by everyone, even by my own brother, who has taken fright at my failure. But I will do my duty, and will remain by this unhappy man, to take care of him and be his nurse." But there was no time to be lost. I ran out of the room. "I shall come back in an hour, and shall not come back alone," I cried. Part 3, Chapter 12 of A Raw Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Raw Youth by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Translated by Constance Garnett. Part 3, Chapter 12. At last I found Tatiana Pavlovna at home. I at once explained everything to her, all about the document, and every detail of what was going on at my lodgings. Though she quite understood the position, and might have fully grasped what was happening in 2 words, yet the explanation took us, I believe, some 10 minutes. I did the talking. I put aside all shame and told her the whole truth. She sat in her chair, silent and immovable, drawing herself up straight as a knitting needle, with her lips compressed, and her eyes fixed upon me, listening greedily. But when I finished, she promptly jumped up from her chair, and with such impetuosity that I jumped up too. "Ah, you puppy! So you really had that letter sewn up in your pocket, and it was sewn up there by that fool Maria Ivanovna? Oh, you shameless villains! So you came here to conquer hearts and take the fashionable world by storm. You wanted to revenge yourself on the devil knows who, because you're an illegitimate son, eh? Tatiana Pavlovna, don't dare to abuse me!" I cried. "Perhaps you, in your abuse, have been the cause from the very beginning of my vindictiveness here. Yes, I am an illegitimate son, and perhaps I worked to revenge myself for being an illegitimate son, and perhaps I did want to revenge myself on the devil knows who. The devil himself could scarcely find who is guilty. But remember, I've cut off all connection with these villains, and have conquered my passions. I will lay the document before her in silence, and will go away without even waiting for a word from her. You'll be the witness of it. Give me the letter. Give me the letter. Lay it on the table at once. But you are lying, perhaps." "It's sewn up in my pocket. Maria Ivanovna sewed it up herself, and when I had a new coat made here, I took it out of the old one and sewed it up in the new coat. Here it is, feel it, I'm not lying." "Give it me, take it out!" Tatiana Pavlovna stormed. "Not on any account, I tell you again. I will lay it before her in your presence, and will go away without waiting for a single word, but she must know and see with her eyes that it is my doing, that I'm giving it up to her of my own accord, without compulsion and without recompense." "Showing off again? You're in love, puppy, eh?" "You may say horrid things to me as much as you like. I've deserved them, but I'm not offended. Oh, I may seem to her a paltry boy who has been keeping watch on her and plotting against her, but let her recognize that I have conquered myself and put her happiness above everything on earth. Never mind, Tatiana Pavlovna, never mind. I keep crying to myself courage and hope. What if this is my first step in life? Anyway, it is ending well, it is ending honorably. And what if I do love her?" I went on fervently, with flashing eyes. "I am not ashamed of it. Mother is a heavenly angel, but she is an earthly queen. Versolov will go back to mother, and I've no cause to be ashamed to face her. You know I once heard what Versolov and she were saying. I stood behind the curtain. Oh, we are all three possessed by the same madness. Oh, do you know whose phrase that is, possessed by the same madness? They are his words, Andrei Petrovitch's. But do you know, perhaps there are more than three of us possessed by the same madness. Yes, I don't mind betting you're a fourth, possessed by the same madness. Shall I say it? I will bet that you've been in love with Andrei Petrovitch all your life, and perhaps you are so still." I repeat, I was carried away by excitement and a sort of happiness, but I could not finish. She suddenly, with superhuman quickness, seized me by the hair and twice shook me backwards and forwards with all her might. Then she suddenly abandoned me and retreated into the corner and hid her face in her handkerchief. "You young puppy! Never dare say that to me again!" she brought out, crying. All this was so unexpected that I was naturally thunderstruck. I stood gazing at her, not knowing what to do. "Foo, you stupid! Come here and give me a kiss, though I am an old fool," she said suddenly, laughing and crying. "And don't you ever dare to say that to me again. But I love you and have always loved you, you stupid." I kissed her. I may mention in parentheses that Tatiana Pavlovna and I were friends from that time forward. "But oh, what am I doing?" she said suddenly, slapping herself on the forehead. "But what were you saying? The old prince is at your lodging? But is it true?" "I assure you he is." "Oh, my goodness! Ah, it makes me sick!" She hurried to and fro about the room. "And they are doing what they like with him there. Eh, is there nothing will frighten the fools? And ever since the morning, oh, Anna Andreevna, oh, the nun, and she, of course, Militrisa, knows nothing about it." "What Militrisa?" "Why, your earthly queen, your ideal. Ah, but what's to be done now?" "Tatiana Pavlovna," I cried, coming to myself, "we've been talking nonsense and have forgotten what matters. I ran out to fetch Katerina Nikolaevna, and they're all waiting for me there." And I explained that I should give up the letter only on condition that she promised to be reconciled to Anna Andreevna at once, and even agree to the marriage. "Quite right, too," Tatiana Pavlovna interposed. "And I've said the same thing to her 100 times. Why, he'll die before the wedding. He won't be married, anyhow. And if he leaves money to Anna in his will, why, their names are in it as it is, and will remain there." "Surely it's not only the money that Katerina Nikolaevna cares about?" "No, she has been afraid all along that the letter was in Anna's hands, and I was afraid of it too. We were keeping watch on her. The daughter did not want to give the old father a shock, and the German, Boering, certainly did feel anxious about the money." "And after that she can marry Boering?" "Why, what's one to do with a little fool? It's a true saying, a fool's a fool and will be a fool forever. He gives her a certain calm, you see. Since I must marry someone, she said, I'll marry him. He will suit me better than anyone, she says, but we shall see afterwards how he suits her. One may tear one's hair afterwards, but then it's too late." "Then why do you allow it? You are fond of her, aren't you? Why, you told her to your face you were in love with her." "Yes, I am in love with her, and I love her more than all the rest of you put together, but she's a senseless little fool all the same." "Well, run and fetch her now, and we will settle it all, and take her to her father ourselves." "But we can't, you little stupid. That's just it. Ach, what are we to do? Ach, it makes me sick." She fell to rushing to and fro again, though she snatched up her shawl. "Ech, if only you had come to me 4 hours earlier. But now it's 8 o'clock, and she went off just now to the Pelistchevs' to dinner, and afterwards she was going with them to the opera." "Good heavens, can't we run to the opera then? Oh no, we can't. What will become of the old man now? He may die in the night." "Listen, don't go there, but go to your mother's for the night, and early tomorrow." "No, I won't desert the old man, whatever happens." "Well, don't desert him. You are right there. But do you know, I'll run round to her and leave a note. I write in our own words. She'll understand that the document's here, and that she must be here at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, punctually. Don't worry yourself. She'll come, she'll obey me, and then we'll put everything right. And you run home and use all your little arts to please the old prince. Put him to bed, and perhaps he'll hold out till the morning. Don't frighten Anna either. I am fond of her too. You are unjust to her because you can't understand. She feels injured. She has been injured from a child. Ah, you've all been a burden on me. Oh, don't forget, tell her from me that I'll see to this business myself, and with a good will, and tell her not to worry, and her pride shall not suffer. You see, of late we've done nothing but quarrel. We've been spitting and scolding at one another. Come, run along. But stay, show me your pocket again. Is it true? Is it true? Oh, is it true? Give me that letter, if only for the night. What is it to you? Leave it. I won't eat it. You may let it slip out of your hands in the night, you know. You'll change your mind?" "Not for anything!" I shouted. "Here, feel it. Look at it. But I won't leave it for anything." "I see it's paper," she said, feeling it with her fingers. "Oh, very well. Go along, and I'll go round to her. Maybe I'll look in at the theatre, too. That was a good idea of yours. But run along, run along." "Tatiana Pavlovna, wait a minute. How is mother?" "She's alive." "And Andrei Petrovitch?" She waved her hand. "He will come to himself." I ran off, feeling cheered and more hopeful, although I had not been successful as I had reckoned to be. But, alas, destiny had decided otherwise, and there were other things in store for me. There certainly is a fate in things. From the stairs I heard a noise in my lodging, and the door of the flat turned out to be open. At the door stood a servant in livery whom I did not know. Pyotr Ippolitovitch and his wife were both in the passage too, looking scared and expectant. The door into the prince's room was open, and I could hear within a voice of thunder, which I could recognize at once, the voice of Boring. I had hardly taken 2 steps forward when I saw the old prince trembling and in tears, led out into the passage by Boring and Baron R., the gentleman who had called on Versilov about the duel. The prince was sobbing loudly, embracing and kissing Boring. Boring was shouting at Anna Andreevna, who had followed the old prince into the passage. Boring was threatening her, and I believe stamped at her. In fact, the coarse German soldier came to the surface in spite of his aristocratic breeding. It afterwards came out that he had somehow got hold of the notion that Anna Andreevna was guilty of something positively criminal, and certainly would have to answer for her conduct before a court of law. In his ignorance, he exaggerated it as the ignorant commonly do, and so considered he had the right to be unceremonious in the extreme. He had not yet got to the bottom of the business. He had been informed of it by an anonymous letter, which I shall have to refer to later, and he had rushed round in that state of fury in which even the most sharp-witted people of his nationality are sometimes prepared to fight like brigands. Anna Andreevna had met all this outburst with the utmost dignity, but I missed that. All I saw was that, after bringing the old man into the passage, Boring left him in the hands of Baron R., and rushing impetuously back to her, shouted, probably in reply to some remark of hers, "You're an intriguing adventuress. You're after his money. You've disgraced yourself in society and will answer for it in a court of law. You are taking advantage of an unfortunate invalid and driving him to madness, and you're shouting at me because I'm a woman and there's no one to defend me." "Oh, yes, you are his betrothed. A fine betrothed," Boring chuckled with spiteful violence. "Baron, Baron, cher enfant, je nous aime," wailed the prince, stretching out his hands towards Anna Andreevna. "Go along, prince, go along. There's been a plot against you, and maybe your life was threatened," shouted Boring. "Oui, oui, je comprends. J'ai compris à commencement." "Prince," Anna Andreevna raised her voice, "you are insulting me, and letting me be insulted." "Get along with you!" Boring shouted at her suddenly. That I could not endure. "Blackguard!" I yelled at him. "Anna Andreevna, I'm here to defend you." What happened then I cannot describe exactly, and will not attempt to. The scene that followed was horrible and degrading. I seemed suddenly to lose my reason. I believe I dashed up and struck him, or at least gave him a violent push. He struck me with all his might on my head, so that I fell on the floor. When I came to, I rushed after them downstairs. I remember that my nose was bleeding. At the entrance a carriage was waiting for them, and while they were getting the prince in, I ran up, and in spite of the lackey who pushed me back, I rushed at Boring again. At this point the police turned up, I don't know how. Boring seized me by the collar, and in a threatening voice ordered the police to take me into custody. I shouted that he ought to come with me, that we might make our affirmation together, and that they dare not take me almost from my own lodging. But as it had all happened in the street, and not in the flat, and as I shouted and fought like a drunken man, and as Boring was wearing his uniform, the policemen took me. but flying into a perfect frenzy, I believe at that point I struck the policeman too. Then I remember two of them suddenly appeared and carried me off. I faintly remember they took me to a room full of tobacco smoke, with all sorts of people standing and sitting about in it, waiting and writing. Here, too, I went on shouting and insisting on making a statement. But things had gone beyond that, and were complicated by violence and resisting the police. Besides, I looked absolutely disreputable. Someone shouted at me angrily. Meanwhile, the policeman charging me with fighting was describing the colonel. "What's your name?" someone shouted to me. "Dolgoruki," I yelled. "Prince Dolgoruki?" Beside myself, I answered by a very coarse word of abuse, and then I remember they dragged me to a very dark little room set apart for drunkards. Oh, I'm not complaining. Readers will have seen of late in the newspapers a complaint made by a gentleman who was kept all night under arrest, tied up, and in a room set apart for drunkards, but I believe he was quite innocent, while I had done something. I threw myself on the common bed which I shared with two unconscious sleepers. My head ached, my temples throbbed, and so did my heart. I must have been unconscious, and I believe I was delirious. I only remember waking up in the middle of the night and sitting on the bed. I remembered everything at once and understood it in all its bearings, and with my elbow propped on my knees and my head in my hands, I sank into profound meditation. Oh, I am not going to describe my feelings, and there is no time to do it, but I will note one thing only. Perhaps I never spent moments more consolatory to my soul than those moments of reflection in the middle of the night on that prison bed. This will perhaps strike the reader as strange, and he may be inclined to set it down to brag and the desire to be original. And yet it was just as I have said. It was one of those minutes which come perhaps to everyone, but only come once in a lifetime. At such moments, men decide their fate, define their point of view, and say to themselves once and for all, that's where the truth lies, and that is the path to take to attain it. Yes, those moments were the light of my soul. Insulted by haughty boring, and expecting to be insulted next day by that aristocratic lady, I knew that I could revenge myself on them, but I decided not to revenge myself. I decided, in spite of every temptation, that I would not produce the letter and publish it to the whole world. The idea had been floating in my mind. I repeated to myself that next day I would put that letter before her, and if need be, instead of gratitude, would bear her ironical smile. But in any case I would not say a word, but would go away from her forever. There is no need to enlarge on this, however. What would happen next day here, how I should be brought before the authorities, and what they would do with me, I almost forgot to think about. I crossed myself with love in my heart, lay down on the bed, and fell into a sound, childlike sleep. I waked up late when it was daylight. I found myself alone in the room. I sat down to wait in silence, and waited about an hour. It must have been about 9 o'clock when I was suddenly summoned. I might go into greater detail, but it is not worth while, for all this is now irrelevant. I need only record what matters. I must note, however, that to my great astonishment I was treated with unexpected courtesy. I was questioned, I answered, and I was at once allowed to depart. I went out in silence, and to my satisfaction saw in their faces some surprise at a man who was able to keep up his dignity even in such circumstances. If I had not noticed that, I should not have recorded it. Tatiana Pavlovna was waiting for me at the entrance. I will explain in a couple of words why I was let off so easily. Early in the morning, by 8 o'clock perhaps, Tatiana Pavlovna had flown round to my lodging, that is, to Pyotr Ippolitovitch's, expecting to find the old prince still there, and she heard at once of all the horrors of the previous day, above all that I had been arrested. She instantly rushed off to Katerina Nikolaevna, who, on returning from the theatre the evening before, had had an interview with the father who had been restored to her. Tatiana Pavlovna waked her up, alarmed her, and insisted that I should be at once released. With a note from her, she flew at once to Boring's and demanded from him forthwith another note to the proper authorities with an urgent request from Boring himself that I should be released, as I had been arrested through a misunderstanding. With this note, she presented herself to the prison, and her request was respectfully granted. Now I will go on with my story. Tatiana Pavlovna pounced on me, put me in a sledge, and took me home with her. She immediately ordered the samovar, and washed and brushed me herself in the kitchen. In the kitchen she told me in a loud voice that at 11:30 Katerina Nikolaevna would come herself, as they had agreed that morning, to meet me. Maria overheard this. A few minutes later she brought in the samovar, and 2 minutes later, when Tatiana Pavlovna called her, she did not answer. It appeared that she had gone out for something. I beg the reader to make special note of this. It was about 9:45, I believe. Though Tatiana Pavlovna was angry at her disappearance without asking leave, she only thought she had gone out to the shop, and immediately forgot about it. And indeed we had no thoughts to spare for it. We talked away without ceasing, for we had plenty to talk about, so that I, at least, scarcely noticed Maria's disappearance. I beg the reader to make a note of that. As for me, I was in a sort of delirium. I poured out my feelings, and above all we were expecting Katerina Nikolaevna, and the thought that in an hour I should meet her at last, and at such a turning point in my life, made me tremble and quiver. At last, when I had drunk 2 cups of tea, Tatiana Pavlovna suddenly stood up, took a pair of scissors from the table, and said, "Let me have your pocket. I must take out the letter. We can't unpick it when she's here." "Yes," I exclaimed, and unbuttoned my coat. "What a muddle it's in! Who sewed it up?" I did, Tatiana Pavlovna." "Well, I can see you did. Come, here it is." We took it out. The old envelope was the same, but inside was a blank sheet of paper. "What's this?" cried Tatiana Pavlovna, turning it round and round. "What's the matter with you?" But I was standing pale and speechless, and I suddenly sank helplessly into a chair. I really almost fainted. "What does it mean?" wailed Tatiana Pavlovna. "Where is your letter?" "Lambert!" I jumped up suddenly, slapping myself on the forehead as I guessed. With breathless haste I explained to her the night at Lambert's and our plot. I had, however, confessed that to her the night before. "They've stolen it! They've stolen it!" I cried, stamping on the floor and clutching at my hair. "That's terrible!" cried Tatiana Pavlovna, grasping what had happened. "What time is it?" It was about 11. There's no Maria. Maria! Maria! "What is it, mistress?" Maria responded from the kitchen. "Are you here? What are we to do now? I will fly to her. Ah, slow coach, slow coach." "And I to Lambert!" I yelled, "and I will strangle him if need be." "Mistress," Maria piped suddenly from the kitchen, "here's a person asking for you very particularly." But before she had time to finish, the person burst in from the kitchen, making a great outcry and lamentation. It was Alphonsine. I will not describe the scene in detail. The scene was a fraud and a deception, but I must say Alphonsine acted it splendidly. With tears of repentance and with violent gesticulations, she babbled, in French of course, that she had unpicked the letter herself, that it was now in Lambert's hands, and that Lambert, together with that brigand, cet homme noir, meant to entice Madame la Générale to shoot her immediately within an hour. That she knew all this from them, and that she had suddenly taken fright because she saw they had a pistol, le pistolet, and now she had rushed off to us that we might go, might save, might warn. That cet homme noir. In fact, it all sounded very probable. The very stupidity of some of Alphonsine's expressions only increased its apparent truthfulness. "What homme noir?" cried Tatiana Pavlovna. "Tiens, j'ai oublié son nom. Un homme affreux. Tiens, Verselov." "Verselov? It cannot be!" I cried. "Oh, yes, it can," wailed Tatiana Pavlovna. "Come, tell us, my good woman, without dancing about. Don't wave your arms about. What do they want? Explain, my good woman. I don't believe they mean to shoot her." My good woman did explain as follows. N.B. It was all a lie. I must remind the reader again. Verselov was to sit at the door, and when she went in, Lambert was to show her cette lettre. Then Verselov was to rush in, and they would... Oh, ils feront leur vengeance. That she, Alphonsine, was afraid there would be trouble, because she had had a share in the business herself. Cette dame, la générale, would certainly come at once, because they had sent her a copy of the letter, and she would see at once that they really had the letter, and would go to interview them. But only Lambert had written the letter, so she knew nothing about Verselov, and Lambert had introduced himself as a stranger who had come from a lady in Moscow, une dame de Moscou, N.B. Marie Ivanovna. "Ah, I feel sick! Ah, I feel sick!" exclaimed Tatiana Pavlovna. "Sauvez-la! Sauvez-la!" cried Alphonsine. Oh, of course there was something inconsistent, even at first sight, in this mad story, but there was no time to think it over, for in essentials it sounded very probable. Of course, one might still suppose, and with the greatest likelihood, that Katerina Nikolaevna, on receiving Lambert's summons, would come first to Tatiana Pavlovna's to discuss the matter with us, and, on the other hand, this might not happen, and she might go straight to him, and then she was lost. It was difficult to believe that she would rush off to a stranger like Lambert at the first summons, yet again, this might somehow happen. After seeing the copy and satisfying herself that they really had her letter, and then there would be disaster anyway. Above all, we had no time even to reflect. Verselov will murder her. If he has stooped to make use of Lambert, he'll murder her. It's the second self, I cried. Ah, that second self, cried Tatiana Pavlovna, wringing her hands. Well, this is no use, she said decidedly. Take your cap and coat, and quick march together. Lead us straight to them, my good woman. Ah, it's a long way. Maria, if Katerina Nikolaevna comes, tell her I shall be back directly, and make her sit and wait for me, and if she does not want to wait, lock the door and keep her by force. Tell her I told her to. 100 rubles for you, Maria, if you deserve it." We ran downstairs. No doubt nothing better could have been suggested, for in any case the chief scene of danger was in Lambert's lodging, and if Katerina Nikolaevna did really come first to Tatiana Pavlovna's lodgings, Maria could always detain her. Yet, after she had called a sledge, Tatiana Pavlovna changed her mind. "You go with her," she bade me, leaving me with Alphonsine, "and if need be, die there. Do you understand? I'll follow you directly, but first I'll whisk round to her. Maybe I shall find her, for say what you like, I feel suspicious." And she flew off to Katerina Nikolaevna. Alphonsine and I went our way towards Lambert's. I urged on the driver and continued to question Alphonsine, but she confined herself to exclamations and finally took refuge in tears. But God saved and preserved us all when everything was hanging on a thread. We had not driven a quarter of the way when I suddenly heard a shout behind me. Someone was calling me by my name. I looked round. Trishatov was driving after us in another sledge. "Where are you going?" he shouted in alarm. "And with her? With Alphonsine?" "Trishatov," I cried, "you told the truth. There is trouble. I am going to that scoundrel Lambert's. Let's go together. The more the better." "Turn back! Turn back at once!" shouted Trishatov. "Lambert's deceiving you, and Alphonsine's deceiving you. The pockmarked fellow sent me. They are not at home. I met Versilov and Lambert just now. They were driving to Tatiana Pavlovna's. They are there now." I stopped the driver and jumped out to join Trishatov. To this day I don't know how I could make up my mind so quickly, but I believed him at once and made up my mind. Alphonsine raised a terrible outcry, but we did not trouble ourselves about her, and I don't know whether she followed us or went home. Anyway, I did not see her again. In the sledge, Trishatov told me breathlessly that there was some sort of plot on foot, that Lambert had been plotting with the pockmarked man, but that the latter had betrayed him at the last moment and had sent Trishatov to Tatiana Pavlovna's to warn her not to believe Lambert and Alphonsine. Trishatov added that he knew nothing more, and that the pockmarked gentleman had told him nothing more, for he had been in a hurry himself, and it had all been settled in haste. "I saw you driving," Trishatov went on, "and drove after you." It was clear, of course, that this pockmarked individual also knew the whole story, since he had sent Trishatov straight to Tatiana Pavlovna's, but that was another mystery. But to avoid a muddle, I will, before describing the catastrophe, explain the actual fact, and for the last time anticipate the order of events. After stealing the letter, Lambert at once got into communication with Versilov. How Versilov could have brought himself to join Lambert, I won't discuss for the time. That will come later. What was chiefly responsible was the second self. After joining Versilov, Lambert still had to entice Katerina Nikolaevna as cunningly as he could. Versilov assured him at once that she would not come. But ever since the day before yesterday, when I met him in the street in the evening, broke off all relations with him, and told him that I should give back the letter at Tatiana Pavlovna's lodgings, and in her presence Lambert had arranged to keep a watch on Tatiana Pavlovna's lodgings. Maria was bought over as a spy. Maria was given 20 rubles, and after the theft of the letter, Lambert visited Maria a second time, settling with her finally and promising to pay her 200 roubles for her services. That was why Maria had rushed from the flat and galloped off in a sledge to Lambert's with the news as soon as she heard that Katerina Nikolaevna was to be at Tatiana Pavlovna's at 11:30, and that I, too, should be present. This was just the information she was to bring Lambert. That was precisely the duty assigned her. Verselov happened to be with Lambert at that very moment. In one moment, Verselov had devised the diabolical plan. They say that madmen are at times extraordinarily cunning. The plot was to lure both of us, Tatiana and me, out of the flat at all costs, if only for a quarter of an hour, but before Katerina Nikolaevna arrived. Then they meant to wait in the street, and as soon as Tatiana Pavlovna and I had come out, to run into the flat, which Maria was to open to them, and there to await Katerina Nikolaevna. Alphonsine, meantime, was to do her utmost to detain us where and how she pleased. Katerina Nikolaevna would be sure to come, as she promised, at 11:30, so that she would certainly be there long before we could be back. Of course, Katerina Nikolaevna had received no summons from Lambert. Alphonsine had told us a lie, and Verselov had invented the story in all its details, and Alphonsine had simply played the part of the frightened traitor. Of course it was a risk, but they probably reasoned that if it answered, all would be well. If it failed, nothing would have been lost, for the document would still be in their possession. But it did answer, and could not possibly have failed to do so, for we could not but follow Alphonsine on the barest supposition that what she said might be true. I repeat again, there was no time to reflect. We ran with Trishatov into the kitchen, and found Maria in a fright. She was horrified to notice that when she let Verselov and Lambert in, that the latter had a revolver in his hand. Though she had taken money, the revolver had not entered into her calculations. She was bewildered and rushed at me as soon as she saw me. "The lady has come, and they've got a pistol." "Trishatov, stay here in the kitchen," I said, "and as soon as I shout, run as quickly as you can to help me." Maria opened the door in the passage, and I slipped into Tatiana Pavlovna's bedroom, into the tiny cupboard of a room in which there was only space for Tatiana Pavlovna's bed, and in which once I had already accidentally played the eavesdropper. I sat down on the bed, and at once found a peephole for myself in the curtain. There was already a noise in the room, and they were talking loudly. I may mention that Katerina Nikolaevna arrived at the flat just a minute after them. I heard the noise and talk from the kitchen. Lambert was shouting. She was sitting on the sofa, and he was standing before her shouting like a fool. Now I know why he lost his head so stupidly. He was in a hurry and afraid they would be discovered. I will explain later who it was he feared. The letter was in his hand, but Verselov was not in the room. I was ready to rush in at the first sign of danger. I record only the gist of the conversation. Perhaps a good deal I don't remember correctly, but I was too much excited to remember with perfect accuracy. "This letter's worth 30,000 roubles, and you are surprised. It's worth 100,000, and I only ask 30, Lambert said in a loud voice, terribly excited. Though Katerina Nikolaevna was evidently frightened, she looked at him with a sort of contemptuous wonder. "I see that a trap has been laid for me, and I don't understand it," she said. "But if only that letter is really in your hands—" "But here it is, see for yourself. Isn't that it? An IOU for 30,000 and not a farthing less," Lambert interrupted her. "I've no money." "Write an IOU. Here's paper. Then go and get the money, and I will wait a week, no more." Give me the money, and then I will give you back the IOU and give you the letter." "You take such a strange tone. You are making a mistake. That letter will be taken from you if I go today and lodge a complaint." "To whom? Ha, ha, ha! What of the scandal? We shall show the letter to the prince. Where are they going to find it? I don't keep the document at my lodging. I shall show it to your father through a third person. Don't be obstinate, madam. Be thankful that I'm not asking much. Any other man would ask for something else besides. You know what, which many a pretty woman would not refuse in such trying circumstances. That's what I mean. Ha, 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 ha! Vous êtes belle, vous." Katerina Nikolaevna rose impetuously, turned crimson, and spat in his face. Then she turned quickly towards the door. It was at this point that the fool Lambert pulled out the revolver. Like an unimaginative fool, he had put blind faith in the effect of the document. His chief error lay in not distinguishing what sort of woman he had to deal with, because, as I have said already, he thought everyone was as mean in their feelings as he was. He angered her from the first word by his rudeness, though perhaps otherwise she might not have declined to consider the question of payment. "Don't stir!" he yelled, furious at her spitting at him, clutching her by the shoulder and showing her the revolver, simply, of course, to frighten her. She uttered a shriek and sank on the sofa. I burst into the room, but at the same instant Verselov ran in at the other door. He had been standing outside the door waiting. In a flash he had snatched the revolver from Lambert, and with all his might hit him on the head with it. Lambert staggered and fell senseless. The blood streamed from his head upon the carpet. She saw Verselov, turned suddenly as white as a sheet, gazed at him for some moments immovable with indescribable horror, and fell into a swoon. He rushed to her. It all flashes before my eyes as I write. I remember with what terror I saw his flushed, almost purple face and his bloodshot eyes. I believe that though he saw me in the room, he did not recognize me. He caught her as she fell unconscious, and with amazing ease lifted her up in his arms as though she were a feather, and began aimlessly carrying her about the room like a baby. It was a tiny room, but he paced to and fro from corner to corner, evidently with no idea why he was doing so. In one instant he had lost his reason. He kept gazing at her face. I ran after him. What I was most afraid of was the revolver, which he seemed to have forgotten in his right hand, and was holding close to her head. But he pushed me away, once with his elbow, and the second time with his foot. I wanted to shout to Trishatov, but I was afraid of irritating the madman. At last I drew back the curtain and began entreating him to put her on the bed. He went up and laid her down on it, stood over her and gazed at her face, and, suddenly bending down, kissed her twice on her pale lips. Oh, I realized at last that this was a man utterly beside himself. He suddenly waved the revolver over her, but, as though realizing, turned the revolver and aimed it at her face. I instantly seized his arm and shouted to Trishatov. I remember we both struggled with him, but he succeeded in pulling away his arm and firing at himself. He would have shot her and then himself, but since we would not let him get at her, he pressed the revolver against his heart. I succeeded, however, in pushing his arm upwards, and the bullet struck him in the shoulder. At that instant, Tatiana Pavlovna burst into the room shrieking, but he was already lying senseless on the carpet beside.
Part 3, Chapter 13 of A Raw Youth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Raw Youth by Fyodor Dostoyevsky, translated by Constance Garnett. Part 3, Chapter 13, Conclusion 1. Almost 6 months have passed since that scene. Much has happened, much has completely changed, and a new life has begun for me since then. But I must settle what I have left doubtful in my story. To me, at least, the first question at the time and long afterwards was, how Verslov could have brought himself to act in concert with a man like Lambert, and what were his objects in doing so. Little by little I have arrived at an explanation of a sort. To my thinking, at those moments, that is, all that last day and the day before, Verslov can have had no definite aim, and I believe indeed he did not reflect on the matter at all, but acted under the influence of a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. But the theory of actual madness I cannot accept, especially as he is not in the least mad now. But the second self I do accept unquestionably. What is a second self exactly? The second self, according to a medical book written by an expert, which I purposely read afterwards, is nothing else than the first stage of serious mental derangement, which may lead to something very bad. And in that scene at my mother's, Verslov himself had with strange frankness described the duality of his will and feelings. But I repeat again, though that scene at mother's and that broken ikon were undoubtedly partly due to the influence of a real second self, yet I have ever since been haunted by the fancy that there was in it an element of a sort of vindictive symbolism, a sort of resentment against the expectations of those women, a sort of angry revolt against their rights and their criticism. And so, hand in hand with the second self, he broke the ikon, as though to say, that's how your expectations will be shattered. In fact, even though the second self did come in, it was partly simply a whim. But all this is only my theory. It would be hard to decide for certain. It is true that in spite of his adoration for Katerina Nikolaevna, he had a deep-rooted and perfectly genuine disbelief in her moral qualities. I really believe that he waited outside the door then to see her humiliated before Lambert. But did he desire it, if even he waited for it? Again, I repeat, I firmly believe that he had no desire, no intention even. He simply wanted to be there, to rush in afterwards, to say something, perhaps to insult, perhaps even to kill her. Anything might happen then, but when he came with Lambert, he had no idea what would happen. I may add that the revolver was Lambert's, and that he himself came unarmed. Seeing her proud dignity, and above all, exasperated by Lambert's blackguardliness in threatening her, he dashed in, and only then went mad. Did he mean to shoot her at that instant? In my opinion, he did not know what he was doing, but he certainly would have shot her if we had not thrust aside his hand. His wound proved to be not a fatal one, and it healed, but he was ill, in bed rather a long time, at mother's, of course. Now, as I am writing these lines, it is the middle of May, an exquisite spring day, and our windows are open. Mother is sitting beside him. He strokes her cheeks and hair, and gazes into her face with tender emotion. Oh, this is only the half of the old Versalov. He never leaves mother's side now, and will never leave her again. He has even gained the gift of tears, as Makar Ivanovitch, of precious memory, said in his story about the merchant. I fancy, however, that Verslov has a long life before him. With us he is perfectly good-natured and candid as a child, though he never loses his sense of proportion and self-control, and does not talk too freely. All his intellect and his moral nature have remained unchanged, though all his ideal side has become more marked. I may say frankly that I have never loved him so much as now, and I regret that I have neither time nor space to say more about him. I will, however, tell one recent anecdote about him, and there are many. He had quite recovered by Lent, and in the 6th week declared that he would fast and take the sacrament. He had not taken the sacrament for 30 years or more, I believe. Mother was delighted. They began preparing Lenten dishes, rather expensive, dainty ones, however. In the next room I heard him on Monday and Tuesday chanting to himself, "The bridegroom cometh," and he was delighted with the verses and the chant. He spoke beautifully of religion several times during those days, but on Wednesday the fast suddenly came to an end. Something suddenly irritated him, some amusing contrast, as he expressed it, laughing. He disliked something in the exterior of the priest, in the surroundings. Whatever it was, he returned and said with a gentle smile, "My friends, I love God, but I am not fitted for that." The same day roast beef was served at dinner. But I know that even now Mother often sits beside him, and in a low voice, with a gentle smile, begins to talk to him of the most abstract subjects. Now she has somehow grown daring with him, but how this has come to pass I don't know. She sits beside him and speaks to him usually in a whisper. He listens with a smile, strokes her hair, kisses her hand, and there is the light of perfect happiness in his face. He sometimes has attacks that are almost like hysterics. Then he takes her photograph, the one he kissed that evening, gazes at it with tears, kisses it, recalls the past, gathers us all round him. But at such moments he says little. Katerina Nikolaevna he seems to have completely forgotten, and has never once mentioned. Nothing has been said of marriage with my mother so far either. They did think of taking him abroad for the summer, but Tatiana Pavlovna strongly opposed it, and he did not desire it himself. They will spend the summer at a villa in some country place in the neighborhood of Petersburg. By the way, we are all still living at the expense of Tatiana Pavlovna. One thing I will add. I am dreadfully sorry that I have several times in this narrative allowed myself to take up a disrespectful and superior attitude in regard to Versalov. But as I wrote, I imagined myself precisely at each of the moments I was describing. As I finish my narrative and write the last lines, I suddenly feel by the very process of recalling and recording, I have re-educated myself. I regret a great deal I have written, especially the tone of certain sentences and pages, but I will not cross them out or correct a single word. I have stated that he never says one word of Katerina Nikolaevna, but I really believe that he is quite cured of his passion. Of her I never speak, except sometimes to Tatiana Pavlovna, and then in secret. Katerina Nikolaevna is now abroad. I saw her before she went away, and visited her several times. Since she has been abroad, I have received 2 letters from her, and have answered them. But of what was in her letter and what we discussed I will say nothing. That is another story, a quite new story, and perhaps it is still in the future. Indeed, there are some things of which I say nothing even to Tatiana Pavlovna, but enough of that. I will only add that she is not married, and that she is travelling with the Polistchefs. Her father is dead, and she is the richest of widows. At this moment she is in Paris. Her rupture with Buring took place very quickly, and as it were of itself, that is, extremely naturally. I will describe it, however. On the morning of that terrible scene, the pock-marked man to whom Trichetoff and his tall friend had gone over succeeded in letting Buring know of the proposed crime. This was how it happened. Lambert still tried to persuade him to work with him, and when he gained possession of the letter, he told him all the details of the undertaking, up to the very last moment, that is, when Verslov suggested the trick to get rid of Tatiana Pavlovna. But at the last moment the pock-marked man, who had more sense than the rest, and foresaw the possibility of a serious crime being committed, preferred to betray Lambert. He reckoned upon Buring's gratitude as something more secure than the fantastic plan made by Lambert, who was clumsy and hot-headed, and by Verslov, who was almost mad with passion. All this I learned afterwards from Trichetoff. I know nothing, by the way, of Lambert's relations with the pock-marked man, and I cannot understand why Lambert could not have acted without him. A question of far more interest for me is why Lambert needed Verslov when, having the letter in his possession, he might perfectly well have dispensed with the latter's assistance. The answer is clear to me now. Verslov was of use to Lambert from his knowledge of all the circumstances. Moreover, if their plans miscarried, or some accident happened, Lambert reckoned on throwing all responsibility on Verslov, and since the latter did not want money, Lambert thought his help very opportune. But Buring did not arrive in time. When he reached the scene of action an hour later, Tatiana Pavlovna's flat wore a very different aspect. 5 minutes after Verslov had fallen on the carpet covered with blood, Lambert, whom we all believed to be dead, raised his head and got up. He looked about him with amazement, quickly grasped the position, went into the kitchen without saying a word, put on his coat, and disappeared for ever. The document he left on the table. I have heard that he was not seriously ill, but only slightly indisposed afterwards. The blow from the revolver had stunned him and drawn blood, but had done no further harm. Meanwhile Trichetoff had run for the doctor, but before the doctor arrived, Verslov too returned to consciousness, though before that Tatiana Pavlovna succeeded in bringing Katerina Nikolaevna to herself and taking her home. And so when Buring ran in upon us, he found in Tatiana Pavlovna's flat only me, the doctor, Verslov, and my mother, who had been fetched by Trichetoff, and though still ill, had come in haste, beside herself with anxiety. Buring stared at us with amazement, and as soon as he learned that Katerina Nikolaevna had gone home, he went off to see her without saying another word to us. He was perturbed. He saw clearly that now scandal and gossip were almost inevitable. The affair did not make any great scandal, however. The pistol shot could not be concealed, it is true, but the chief facts remained almost unknown. All that was discovered by the investigation that was made was that a certain V, a man passionately in love, though almost 50 and with a family, had declared his feelings to the young lady, a person worthy of the highest respect, who did not share his sentiments, and in a sudden access of madness had shot himself. Nothing more than this came out, and in that form the story even got into the papers, no names being mentioned, but only initials. I know that Lambert was not troubled in any way. Nevertheless, Buring was alarmed. To make matters worse, he chanced to learn of the interview between Katerina Nikolaevna and Verslov 2 days before the catastrophe. This enraged him, and he rather incautiously ventured to observe to Katerina Nikolaevna that after that he was not surprised that such extraordinary adventures could happen to her. Katerina Nikolaevna refused him on the spot, without anger, but without hesitation. All her preconceived ideas of the judiciousness of marrying such a man vanished like smoke. Possibly she had seen through him long before, and perhaps the shock she had been exposed to had changed some of her views and feelings. But of that again I will say nothing. I will only add that Lambert made his escape to Moscow, and that I have heard he got into trouble over something there. Trichetoff I have lost sight of since that day, though I am still trying to track him. He vanished after the death of his friend Le Grand Dadais, who shot himself. II I have mentioned the death of the old Prince Nikolai Ivanovitch. The good-natured, kindly old man died not long after his adventure. His death took place, however, quite a month later, in his bed at night from a stroke. I never saw him again after the day he was in my flat. I was told that during that month he became far more rational, more tender in his manner even. He ceased to be apprehensive, shed no more tears, and did not once utter a word about Anna Andreevna. All his affection was centered on his daughter. On one occasion, a week before his death, Katerina Nikolaevna suggested inviting me to entertain him, but he actually frowned. I simply state this fact without trying to explain it. His estate turned out to be in good order at his death, and he left a very considerable fortune as well. A third of this fortune was by his will divided between his innumerable goddaughters, but it struck every one as strange that there was no mention of Anna Andreevna in his will at all. Her name was omitted. But I know for a fact that a few days before his death the old man summoned his daughter and his friends, Politchev and Prince V., and instructed Katerina Nikolaevna, in view of the possibility of his speedy decease, to set aside out of his fortune 60,000 roubles for Anna Andreevna. He expressed his wishes briefly, clearly, and precisely, not indulging in a single exclamation or explanation. After his death, and when his affairs were put in order, Katerina Nikolaevna, through her lawyer, informed Anna Andreevna that the 60,000 roubles were at her disposal, but dryly, with no unnecessary words, Anna Andreevna declined the money. She refused to accept it, in spite of every assurance that this had been the old prince's desire. The money still lies waiting for her, and Katerina Nikolaevna still hopes to induce her to change her mind. But this will never happen, of that I am positive, for I am now one of Anna Andreevna's closest and most intimate friends. Her refusal made rather a stir, and people talked about it. Her aunt, Madame Fanariatov, who had been annoyed at first by her scandalous affair with the old prince, suddenly took a different view of it, and after she refused the money, made her a solemn assurance of her respect. Her brother, on the other hand, quarreled with her finally on account of it, but though I often go to see Anna Andreevna, I cannot say that we ever discuss anything very intimate. We never refer to the past. She is very glad to see me, but talks to me chiefly of abstract subjects. Among other things, she has told me that she is firmly resolved to go into a convent. That was not long ago, but I don't believe this, and look upon it simply as an expression of bitterness. But what is really tragic is what I have to tell of my sister Liza's fate. That is real unhappiness. What are all my failures beside her bitter lot? It began with Prince Sergei Petrovitch's dying in the hospital before his trial. He died before Prince Nikolai Ivanovitch. Liza was left to face the world with her unborn child. She did not shed tears, and was outwardly calm. She became gentle and resigned, but all her old fire seemed to have vanished forever. She helped mother meekly, nursed Andrei Petrovitch through his illness, but became very silent, and never seemed to notice any one or anything, as though nothing mattered to her, as though she were simply passing by. When Versalov was better, she began to sleep a great deal. I used to take her books, but she did not read. She became terribly thin. I did not dare to try to comfort her, though I often went in to her intending to, but in her presence I could not approach her, and I found no words to speak to her. It went on like this till something terrible happened. She fell down our stairs. She did not fall far, only 3 steps, but it brought on a miscarriage, and she was ill all the rest of the winter. Now she is on her feet again, but her health has been shaken, and it will be a long time before she is strong. She is still dreamy and silent with us, but she has begun to talk with mother a little. These last few days we have had bright, clear spring sunshine, and I am all the while inwardly recalling that sunny morning last autumn, when she and I walked along the street, both full of joy and hope and love for one another. Alas, what has happened since then? I don't complain. For me a new life has begun, but for her? Her future is a problem, and I cannot look at her even now without pain. 3 weeks ago I did succeed, however, in interesting her with news of Vassen. He was released at last and is now at liberty. That judicious person gave, so I am told, the most precise explanation and the most interesting information, which completely cleared his character in the eyes of those on whom his fate depended. Moreover, his celebrated manuscript turned out to be no more than a translation from the French, upon which he had intended to write an article for a magazine. He is now in the X province, and his stepfather Stebelkoff is still in prison on the same charge, which I hear grows more extensive and complicated as it goes on. Liza heard the news of Vassen with a strange smile, and even observed that that was just what was sure to have happened to him. But she was evidently pleased, no doubt, that Prince Sergei's action had not brought worse harm to Vassen. Of Dergatchev and his friends I have nothing to say here. I have finished. Perhaps some reader may care to know what has become of my idea, and what is the new life that is beginning for me now, to which I refer so mysteriously. But that new life, that new way which is opening before me, is my idea, the same as before, though in such a different form that it could hardly be recognized. But I cannot enter into that in this story. That is something quite different. My old life has passed away completely, and the new is just beginning. But I will add one essential matter. Tatiana Pavlovna, a true and dear friend to me, pesters me almost every day with exhortations to enter the university. When you've taken your degree, she says, then you can consider the position, but now you must finish your studies. I must confess I am considering her suggestion, but I don't know how I shall decide. Among other objections, I have urged that I have not the right to continue my studies, as it is my duty now to work to maintain mother and Liza. But she offers to undertake this, and she says her means are sufficient to do so all the time I am at the university. I have determined at last to ask the advice of someone. Looking about me, I have chosen that someone carefully and critically. I have fixed on Nikolai Semyonovitch, my former tutor in Moscow, the husband of Marie Ivanovna. Not so much that I need advice about anything, but I feel an irresistible longing to hear the opinion of this outsider, who is a rather coldly egoistic but undoubtedly clever man. I have sent him my whole manuscript, asking him to keep it secret from everyone, especially Tatiana Pavlovna, because I have not shown it to anyone so far. The manuscript came back to me a fortnight later, and with it a rather long letter. From this letter I make a few extracts, as I find in them a certain general view, and something that may be explanatory. Here are the extracts. 3. You could never have employed your leisure time more profitably, my ever-precious Arkady Makarovitch, than in writing this autobiography. You have given yourself, so to say, an unflinching account of your first stormy, perilous steps on the path of life. I quite believe that you may, by this exposition, have to a great extent re-educated yourself, to use your own expression. I shall not, of course, venture upon the smallest criticism, though every page makes one reflect. For instance, the circumstance that you so long and so obstinately retained possession of the document is highly characteristic. But that is only one remark out of hundreds which I permitted myself. I greatly appreciate also the fact of your deciding to confide to me, and apparently to me alone, the secret of your idea, to use your own expression. But your request that I should give you my opinion on that idea I must resolutely refuse. To begin with, it would be out of place in a letter, and secondly, I am not prepared to give an answer off-hand. I must ruminate upon it further. I will only observe that your idea is distinguished by originality, whereas young men of the present generation for the most part throw themselves into ready-made ideas, of which there is always an ample provision, and which are a source of danger. Your idea, for instance, did at any rate save you for the time from the ideas of Messrs. Dergatchev and Company, certainly less original than yours. Finally, I am absolutely in agreement with that honored lady, Tatiana Pavlovna, whom I had till now failed to esteem as she deserves, though I know her personally. Her plan that you should enter the university will be of the greatest possible benefit for you. Study and life will undoubtedly in 3 or 4 years widen the horizon of your ideas and aspirations, and if after the university you still desire to return to your idea, there will be nothing to prevent it. Now allow me, though you have not requested it, to give you frankly some thoughts and impressions that have occurred to my mind while perusing your extremely candid autobiography. Yes, I agree with Andrei Petrovitch that one might well feel anxiety about you and your solitary youth, and there are more than a few lads like you, and there really is always a danger of their talents leading them astray, either into secret sensuality or a latent desire for lawlessness. But this thirst for lawlessness proceeds most frequently, perhaps, from a latent craving for discipline and seemliness. I'm using your own words. Youth is pure just because it is youth. Perhaps in these precocious impulses of madness there lie concealed a craving for discipline and a search for truth, and whose fault is it that some young people of to-day see that truth and that discipline in such stupid and ridiculous things that one cannot imagine how they can believe in them? I may mention, by the way, that in the recent past, a generation ago at most, such interesting lads were not so much to be pitied, for in those days they almost always ended by successfully attaching themselves to our most highly cultivated class and merging into it, and even if they did at the onset recognize their own lack of order and consistency, the lack of nobility even in their family surroundings, the lack of an ancestral tradition and of fine finished forms of social life, it was a gain for them, for they consciously strove towards all this and thereby learned to prize it. Nowadays the position is somewhat different, for there is scarcely anything the young can attach themselves to. I will explain by comparison, or so to say, by analogy. If I had been a Russian novelist and had talent, I should certainly have chosen my heroes from the old nobility, because only in that type of cultivated Russian is it possible to find at least that outward semblance of fine order and aesthetic beauty so necessary in a novel to produce an artistic effect on the reader. I am not joking when I say this, although I am not a nobleman myself, as you are indeed aware. Pushkin selected the subject for his future novels from the traditions of the Russian family, and believe me that everything beautiful we have had so far is to be found therein. Everything that has been brought to some sort of perfection anyway. I don't say this because I am accepting unconditionally the truth and justness of that beauty, but at least there were completely worked out forms of honor and duty which have never existed anywhere in Russia except in the nobility, even in the most rudimentary shape. I speak as a calm man seeking calm. Whether that honor was a good thing, and whether that duty was a true one, is a secondary question. What to my mind is of most consequence is the finality of the forms, and the existence of some sort of order, not prescribed from above, but developed from within. Good heavens, what matters most of all for us is to have any sort of order of our own. All hopes for the future, and so to say restfulness of outlook, lie in our having something at last built up, instead of this everlasting destruction, instead of chips flying in all directions, rubbish and disorder, which has led to nothing for 200 years. Don't accuse me of Slavophilism. I only say this from misanthropy, for my heart is heavy. Something is happening to us today, and in the recent past, the very opposite of what I have imagined above. It is not that the worthless attach themselves to the highest stratum of society, but on the contrary, with light-hearted haste, fragments are torn from what is fine and noble and thrown into one mass with the lawless and the envious. And there have been many instances of fathers and heads of what have been cultured families laughing at what their children perhaps would have liked to believe in. What is more, they eagerly display to their children their spiteful pleasure at the sudden license to be dishonest, which they have all at once deduced wholesale from something. I am not speaking of the true progressives, dear Arkady Makarovitch, but only of that rabble, so numerous it seems, of whom it has been said, grattez la Russe et vous verrez le Tatar, and believe me, there are by no means so many true liberals, true and noble friends of humanity among us as we have imagined. But all this is theorizing. Let us come back to our supposed novelist. The position of our novelist in this case would be perfectly definite. He could not write in any other form but the historical, for there is no fine type in our day, and if there were remnants of it left they would not, according to the prevalent ideas of the day, have retained their beauty. Oh, and in historical form it is possible to depict a multitude of extremely attractive and consolatory details. It is possible so to fascinate the reader, indeed, that he will take the historical picture for the possible and the actual. Such a work, if executed with great talent, would belong not so much to Russian literature as to Russian history. It would be a picture artistically worked out of the Russian ideal, having a real existence so long as it was not guessed that it was an ideal. The grandson of those heroes who have been depicted in a picture of a Russian family of the upper middle cultivated class during 3 generations, side by side with and in connection with Russian history, that descendant of his forefathers would not be depicted in his modern type, except in a somewhat misanthropic, solitary, and distinctly melancholy aspect. He is even bound to appear a somewhat strange figure, so that the reader might from the first glance recognize him as one retreating from the field of action, and might be convinced there was no field of action left for him. A little further, and even that misanthrope, that grandson of heroes, will disappear entirely. New characters will appear, unknown to us as yet, and a new ideal. But what sort of characters? If they are without beauty, then the Russian novel is impossible in the future. But alas, will the novel be the only thing impossible? I will not pursue this further, but will hasten back to your manuscript. Consider, for instance, both the families of Monsieur Verseloff. For this once I will venture to be quite open. I won't enlarge on Andrei Petrovitch himself, but he is any way of a good old family. He is a nobleman of ancient lineage, and at the same time a Parisian commonard. He is a true poet, and loves Russia, yet denies her absolutely. He is without any sort of religion, but yet almost ready to die for something indefinite, to which he cannot give a name, but in which he fervently believes, like a number of Russian adherents of European civilization of the Petersburg period of Russian history. But enough of him. As for his legitimate family, I won't discuss his son, and indeed he is not worthy of the honor. All who have eyes know what upstarts like that come to in Russia, and what they bring others to as well. Then his daughter, Anna Andreevna, she is surely a girl of strong character, a figure on the scale of the mother abbess Mitrofania. Not that I mean to predict anything criminal, which would be unjust on my part. If you can assure me, Arkady Makarovitch, that that family is an exceptional phenomenon, it will rejoice my heart. But would it not be, on the contrary, a truer conclusion that a multitude of unquestionably aristocratic Russian families are with irresistible force passing in masses into exceptional families, and mingling with them in the general lawlessness and chaos? A typical example of such an exceptional family is sketched by you in your manuscript. Yes, Arkady Makarovitch, you are a member of an exceptional family, in contrary distinction to the aristocratic types, who have had such a very different childhood and adolescence from yours. I must say I should not like to be a novelist whose hero comes of an exceptional family. To describe him is an ungrateful task, and can have no beauty of form. Moreover, these types are in any case transitory, and so a novel about them cannot have artistic finish. One may make serious mistakes, exaggerations, misjudgments. In any case, one would have to guess too much. But what is the writer to do who doesn't want to confine himself to the historical form, and is possessed by a longing for the present? To guess and make mistakes. But such an autobiography as yours might serve as material for a future work of art, for a future picture of a lawless epoch already past. Oh, when the angry strife of the day has passed, and the future has come, then a future artist will discover beautiful forms for depicting past lawlessness and chaos. Then such autobiographies as yours, so long as they are sincere, will be of use and provide material. In spite of their chaotic and fortuitous character, they will preserve, at any rate, some faithful traits by which one may guess what may have lain hidden in the heart of some raw youth of that troubled time, a knowledge not altogether valueless, since from raw youths are made up the generations. End of Part 3, Chapter